Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's see, can everyone hear me? If I can get, looks like maybe a yes. Okay.
Yep, all good.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So thank you for joining us today for this really important and fascinating workshop and webinar. Before we get started, just a couple of announcements. First of all, if any of you are non-members, we invite you to join BAPA. If you join now, it'll be for the remainder of this year as well as for 2025. And it's going to allow you to come to our exciting holiday party on December 7th. And there's lots of other benefits, of course, to our membership, including networking with each other, our listserv, discounts on workshops, and so forth. And we also want to announce / remind everyone about our next webinar, which was rescheduled, and it's on ableism and the intersectionality and disability. It'll be a panel discussion, and that is going to be held on January 24th. So without further ado, I think I will go ahead and jump in and introduce our wonderful speaker and presenter today. So we have today Dr. Liya Levanda, who holds a PsyD in clinical psychology from the California School of Professional Psychology, or Alliant University. And she brings a modern perspective on Jewish issues, particularly anti-Semitism, as they pertain to clinical psychology. She's been studying and practicing social justice theory and works towards a future in psychology that can address all forms of discrimination and hatred, anti-Semitism included, of course. Dr. Levanda has a number of publications and is a sought-after speaker who has presented at many universities, as well as regional and national conferences. And I have heard her speak a number of times myself, and she is truly wonderful. So I'm very excited that she is able to join us today. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to you, Dr. Levanda. Thank you.
Gosh, what an introduction. Thank you so much, Sasha. It is so lovely to be with you all this morning. Thank you so much for spending your Sunday morning with me for the next 3 hours. I am super excited to jump into this. Just some sort of housekeeping things. I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that here in North America, we do reside on and benefit from land that was stolen from Indigenous tribes. And so I would like for us all to take a moment and think about whose tribe's lands you are currently in, or maybe look it up if you're unsure. My slides were developed while benefiting from Shoshone, Western Shoshone, Ohlone, Coast Miwok, Pomo, Luiseno, Washoe, Northern Paiute, and Southern Paiute lands. I'll also be taking moments to check in and ask about questions. And I find that this presentation tends to be the most beneficial when we're able to have discussions. So I really encourage you to pop some questions in the chat. We do have some folks monitoring the chat. Unmute if that's what you feel more comfortable doing. And we're looking forward to this conversation. Before we get started, I would love to launch our first poll and get a sense of who all is joining us today. I would love for you to let me know if you are here as a Jewish clinician or as one of our wonderful allies. And we're only answering the first question for now. The next 2 questions will be coming up later. Give folks another minute or 2 to answer. And then the next 2 questions will be coming up later. So Annette or whoever's in charge of polls, if it's possible to fire those back up when they're needed. All right, it looks like we have got really excellent representation from both of our groups. We have both Jewish clinicians here and some of our allies. Are we able to share the results? Amazing, thanks so much. I find this to be really helpful in sort of orienting ourselves to who we're sharing space with today. So thank you to all those who participated. All right, some housekeeping before we jump in. I have no conflicts of interest to declare. I don't have any financial interest in any of the third-party materials that I recommend. I just think they're really incredible resources. I do also do work for other organizations, and I'm not here representing any of them in any capacity. All right, if your intention here is to learn, you are in the right place. My motto is that there's no such thing as a dumb question. My family and I are Jewish and Israeli, and so this presentation will be covering an area of expertise of mine, which is lived experiences of Jewish people experiencing anti-Semitism. And this is reflected in the learning objectives. What's not in the learning objectives and what I will not be covering is anything outside of my area of expertise. This includes things like Islamophobia, the ins and outs of the Middle East, etc. This boundary isn't because I don't think these topics are important. It's actually quite the opposite. I really do want to make it clear that this space is pro-Palestinian in supporting Palestinian liberation, self-determination, and safety. And I encourage each and every one of you to seek further training and consultation to understand these areas. But this training will not be covering these things because I can't speak to lived experiences of Muslim people or Palestinians, nor am I an expert in foreign policy, and I'm not going to attempt to present myself as such. These topics deserve their own training, just as anti-Semitism deserves its own training. Multiple experiences can be valid and true, and they can also be contradictory. And so my job today is to educate and inform on the lived experiences of Jews facing anti-Semitism. On a similar note, this is a training to learn about anti-Semitism in the context of our role as mental health professionals. This is not a political forum to debate war, foreign policy, etc., nor is this an appropriate place to do so. Finally, please be respectful of the learning environment and of each other. We will have some time for Q&A at the end, and like I said before, if you have questions that come up before that, do please pop them in the chat. For the sake of easy referencing and fact-checking, I've included the citations in every slide at the bottom left-hand corner, which you can easily cross-reference in the complete reference list that was included in the materials for this presentation. And finally, in the spirit of trauma-informed care, I also wanted to let people know that we are going to be discussing some topics that people might find distressing. We'll be discussing specific examples of anti-Semitism, some of which are violent in nature. Furthermore, while I don't believe that that discussion of politics is necessarily supportive of our learning goals, it is impossible to completely separate anti-Semitism from politics and current events. And so tensions in the Middle East will be addressed. And, anti-Semitism isn't exactly a light-hearted topic in general. And so I encourage you to take care of yourselves during today's training, knowing the difference between tolerating discomfort of an unpleasant topic that might trigger fragility or defensiveness versus needing some space away to re-regulate in order to prioritize your needs. All right, with all that out of the way, let's get rolling. I have a completely separate training that provides mental health professionals with relevant background information on Judaism and details, considerations, and guidelines for working with Jewish patients. I've actually, in the handouts for today's training, I've included one of the handouts that I provide with that training, which has some basic things to know about Judaism. This is not that training. However, there are still things to know about Jews and Judaism that will come up in our discussions on anti-Semitism. So I will attempt to very quickly synthesize this relevant information, and we're all just going to know and agree that the following information is incomplete and non-exhaustive, okay? So, Judaism is most well known as a religion. However, Judaism is much more than that. It's often referred to as an ethno-religion. Melanie K. Kantrowitz best described it as this, quote, "Religion is only part of Jewishness. Jewishness is a peoplehood, a culture, a shared history, and an ethnic identity," end quote. As such, the concept of being Jewish is more than just religious expression, but it is one of them. Someone is Jewish if they practice Judaism, which is the oldest Abrahamic monotheistic religion. This includes people who were born into Judaism as well as people who converted into Judaism. This leads me to the next way that one can be Jewish, which is through ancestry. So even if someone was born Jewish and doesn't practice Judaism as a religion, they are still considered a Jew, no more or less Jewish than those who observe the religion. Now, an interesting fact here about Jewish ancestry is that it's traditionally traced through the mother or matrilineally. That means that if somebody has a Jewish mother and a non-Jewish father, they're considered Jewish. But if they have a non-Jewish mother and a Jewish father, they're actually not considered Jewish. This is a very ancient rule that in modern times is becoming increasingly controversial because patrilineal Jews want recognition, and rightfully so. So that's why I have that little asterisk there. The third way that somebody can be Jewish is through culture. This refers to people who grew up with Jewish traditions and experienced the impacts of Jewish generational trauma. Just like many Americans might celebrate Christmas and Christmas culture without identifying as religious themselves, many Jews identify with the concept of being culturally Jewish, even if they don't deeply identify with the religious meaning behind everything. Some more things that I think are important to know about Jews is that we're actually a pretty small group. If you looked ahead at the materials or if you've learned about Jews before, you might know that Jews only make up about 2.4% of the US population and a mere 0.2% of the global population. And many people are actually surprised to hear this, given what's perceived as a prevalence of Jews in their Bronfenbrennerian type bubbles. So if you grew up in an area with a concentrated Jewish population, like New York, Los Angeles, Miami, Philadelphia, Boston, the Bay Area, especially the South Bay, you probably have experienced a lot of Jews in your environment. However, that's not necessarily something that's reciprocated or is similar in other cities or states around the United States. It is important to note, though, that about half of the world's Jews do live in the United States. Judaism also has both individualistic and collectivistic elements, but it ultimately places really significant emphasis on collectivistic values, such as benefit to the community. We'll cover this one in more depth later on, but I do think it's early to bring up this early, that the Jewish people have experienced a lot of generational trauma. Probably the most well-known big one is the Holocaust, but Jews have experienced plenty of other traumas, both macro and micro. One of those, the destruction of the temple and the expulsion of Jews from their indigenous homeland in about the 6th century BCE, is why Jews are considered diasporic. That means that after being forced out of their homeland, Jews resettled all around the world. Are there any questions so far? I'll take that as a no. Excellent. This leads me to my next question, and if we can launch the question number 2 in our poll, are Jews white? Take a moment to think about this if we're able to launch question number 2 for our poll. Let's see what people think about this. So we're looking at question number 2 here. It looks like we might have ended the poll early. Was anybody able to answer the questions? I see about 5 responses. Oh, okay, thank you. There we go. Give folks another minute or two, a couple more seconds. All right, if we can end that poll and share the results, it looks like a pretty nice mix across the board. Most people are saying, kind of depends. There's some people who aren't sure, that's totally fine. Some people do think that they know the answer. This is a really great starting point for this next section. So many people are surprised to learn that Jews come in all colors. After being forced out of their indigenous homeland thousands of years ago, resettling around the world has meant that several distinct groups of Jews have developed over time based on how populations of Jews in specific regions have existed throughout the centuries. Now, globally speaking, or I guess nationally speaking, the majority of Jews in the United States that we may think of as white are Ashkenazi Jews, meaning that their ancestry can be traced back to Eastern Europe. There are also Sephardi or Sephardic Jews, whose ancestors came from the Iberian Peninsula, as well as Mizrahi Jews, whose lineage can be traced to the Middle East and parts of Africa. These are the major Jewish ethnic divisions, but there are so many other diverse Jewish communities. We've got the Kaifeng Jews of China, we've got the Beta Israel Jews of Ethiopia, the Bnei Menashe Jews of India, I can go on. For my visual learners who are watching, this is a map that I think illustrates these major groups of the Jewish diaspora pretty well. The dark blue in the north represents Ashkenazi Jews. The red raspberry represents Sephardic Jews. And then that teal greenish represents Mizrahi Jews. That mustard yellow represents those other independent groups that I mentioned, such as the Beta Israel Jews and the Kaifeng Jews. This map is definitely a generalization, and it certainly doesn't include every subgroup of Jewish ethnic categories under the sun, but I do think that this serves as a useful introduction to understanding the Jewish diaspora. So in the context of this question of whether Jews are white, it's most often referring to Ashkenazi Jews, who again, their diasporic roots can be traced back to some of the same regions as many white-presenting folks in America originate from. Of note, the majority of Jews in the US are Ashkenazi Jews, but this is actually not a trend that's reflected in global populations. Particularly in Israel, Ashkenazi Jews are estimated to comprise no more than about half of Israel's Jews. This is important to consider when we think about who the majority is and who the majority represents. Race is a tricky thing. It's a social construct that was created with the intention to separate and hegemonize other groups based on the color of their skin. Race has been used as a way to categorize populations, but it isn't a lens that works in every society, and it's not used in every society. Jewish ethnic groups, as we just learned, don't exactly fit neatly into these racial categories because of Jews' lived experiences. Race was a term that was infrequently used until about the 1500s, but it did play a key role in the building of America, and the role it continues to play in present day cannot and should not be ignored. Now, as with other groups and societies where colorism is present, Jews with lighter skin do benefit from the privileges associated with that. But because race as a concept doesn't really translate to understanding the Jewish diaspora, Jewish people have varying levels of identification with the concept of using any racial identifier, not just whiteness, when it comes to accurately and wholly describing their identity. When it comes to whiteness, it's also important to contextualize this with the fact that this fascination almost with putting racial identifiers on Jews has increased in popularity because of those trying to paint the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as a race issue in order to make it better fit the lens of racial inequity that is seen in the United States. However, as anti-Semitism advocate Hillary Hahn put it, quote, "Having light skin does not spare Jews from anti-Semitism," end quote. Questions about that? All right, great. Now that we've sort of oriented ourselves, I want to start our deep dive today into anti-Semitism. But the first thing that we have to do is understand what we're talking about when we use the word anti-Semitism. And before we even do that, we have to clear up some confusion and ambiguity as to what word we're using to describe this phenomenon. As Deborah Lipstadt writes in her 2019 book, Anti-Semitism Here and Now, a hyphenated anti-Semitism suggests the existence of a Semitism, which doesn't really make sense. There's no such thing as a Semitic people. The term Semitic was actually coined in the 1700s by a German historian to describe languages with linguistic similarities in the Middle East, Hebrew and Arabic included. The term anti-Semitism was popularized by a Jew-hating German journalist, say that 3 times fast, in the late 19th century as a tool to further alienate Jews. And this journalist thought that using a word such as anti-Semitism sounded scientific enough to be taken seriously. And so his intention here, according to Lipstadt, was, quote, "hatred of the Jewish race," unquote. So we said, okay, let's remove the hyphen and make it one word. But some people still think this is not the best word to use if you think about it, knowing what we know about the origins of that word. And so some people have suggested using the term Jew hatred. It certainly has a lot more face validity, and there's no doubts as to what it's referring to. As part of developing these trainings that I do, I had the opportunity and privilege to sit down with Mr. Vlad Chaikin, who is the National Director on Programs for Anti-Semitism with the Anti-Defamation League, more commonly known as the ADL. And he pointed out that the word hatred connotes a conscious aspect to these thoughts and feelings towards Jews. Like, you choose to hate someone, you have reasons for hating someone. And as we're going to learn in our time together today, this phenomenon of dislike for Jews is actually subconscious or even unconscious. And so the term that we're going to be using today is the most even compromise and is also the most well-recognized term, which is anti-Semitism, one word, no hyphen. You'll see today that I am big on definitions. The world has been big on definitions as well, as it struggled to have a precise definition of what anti-Semitism even is. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, Sweden's prime minister at the time, a man named Göran Persson, initiated a global international Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or the IHRA, the only global intergovernmental organization that's focused solely on Holocaust-related issues, including anti-Semitism. The IHRA is comprised of 35 countries, including Sweden, the UK, the Netherlands, Poland, Germany, France, the United States, and Israel. In 2016, the IHRA adopted this non-legally binding working definition on anti-Semitism. Quote, "Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestation of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, towards Jewish community institutions and religious facilities," unquote. But wait, it's not done. The definition of anti-Semitism by the IHRA continues into providing some examples of how anti-Semitism can manifest. And so as we go through this list, please reflect on whether you've heard of, witnessed, or even been the victim of any of these examples. Quote, "Contemporary examples of anti-Semitism in public life, the media, schools, the workplace, and in the religious sphere could, taking into account the overall context, include, but are not limited to, calling for, aiding, or justifying the killing or harming of Jews in the name of a radical ideology or an extremist view of religion. making mendacious, dehumanizing, demonizing, or stereotypical allegations about Jews as such, or the power of Jews as collective, such as, especially but not exclusively, the myth about a world Jewish conspiracy, or of Jews controlling the media, economy, government, or other societal institutions. Accusing Jews as a people of being responsible for real or imagined wrongdoing committed by a single Jewish person or group, or even for acts committed by non-Jews. One more. Accusing Jews of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interests of their own nations. Denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, e.g. by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. Applying double standards by requiring of it a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. Using the symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism, e.g. claims of Jews killing Jesus or blood libel, to characterize Israel or Israelis. Drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. Holding Jews collectively responsible for the actions of the state of Israel. End quote. So this is the IHRA's definition of anti-Semitism, which has been in practice since about 2016. Now, the IHRA definition has been accepted by many as standard, but some felt that the definition was unclear and it did not provide enough guidance as it related to discussing Israel-Palestine. So, in 2020, a group of academics published the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism as a response to the IHRA definition, named so because it was developed under the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. It offers a more concise definition and more detailed examples, especially as they relate to discussing Palestine and Israel. The JDA starts out exactly as promised, short, sweet, and to the point. Anti-Semitism is discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews, or Jewish institutions as Jewish. All right, I'm going to do some more reading. Bear with me. It goes on to state, quote, "It is racist to essentialize, treat as a character trait or as inherent, or to make sweeping negative generalizations about a given population. What is true of racism in general is true of anti-Semitism in particular. What is particular in classic anti-Semitism is the idea that Jews are linked to the forces of evil. This stands at the core of many anti-Jewish fantasies, such as the idea of a Jewish conspiracy in which the Jews possess hidden power that they use to promote their own collective agenda at the expense of other people. This linkage between Jews and evil continues in the present, in the fantasy that the Jews control governments with a hidden hand, that they own the banks, control the media, act as a state within a state, and are responsible for spreading disease such as COVID-19. All these features can be instrumentalized by different and even antagonistic political causes. Anti-Semitism can be manifested in words, visual images, and deeds. Examples of anti-Semitic words include utterances that all Jews are wealthy, inherently stingy, or unpatriotic. In anti-Semitic caricatures, Jews are often depicted as grotesque, with big noses, and associated with wealth. Examples of anti-Semitic deeds are assaulting someone because she or he is Jewish, attacking a synagogue, daubing swastikas on Jewish graves, or refusing to hire or promote people because they are Jewish. Anti-Semitism can be direct or indirect, explicit or coded. For example, the Rothschilds control the world is a coded statement about the alleged power of the Jews over banks and international finance. Similarly, portraying Israel as the ultimate evil or grossly exaggerating its actual influence can be a coded way of racializing and stigmatizing Jews. In many cases, identifying coded speech is a matter of context and judgment, taking account of these guidelines. Denying or minimizing that the Holocaust by claiming that the deliberate Nazi genocide of the Jews did not take place, or that there were no extermination camps or gas chambers, or that the number of victims was a fraction of the actual total, is anti-Semitic." End quote. The Jerusalem Declaration then goes on to specify examples of what is and isn't anti-Semitic in regards to discussing politics and foreign policy in Palestine and Israel, but we'll get to that in a little bit. But for now, I want to check in because I just read a lot of definitions at y'all. So I would love to hear either people unmuting or maybe typing something in the comments. What are folks' reactions to these definitions? Take a minute to process, take a deep breath, and check in with yourself.
This is Christine. These are just wonderful. Very concise and very clear. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can't take all the credit, Christine. I just took this directly from the websites, but I appreciate that. Does anyone have any questions about defining anti-Semitism? All right, in that case, we will move on. Now that we know what anti-Semitism is, we can start looking more closely at what anti-Semitism can actually look like. And so to start out, we're going to familiarize ourselves with some common anti-Semitic tropes. The ADL has a brilliant website breaking these down and providing examples. It is linked in my resources page for those who are interested. I want you to think about that those definitions that we just looked at as we investigate these tropes with more attention. The anti-Semitic trope of power argues that Jews are not only out for total world domination, but they're already well on their way because they already control things like the banks and the weather. A phenomenon known as scapegoating is all too common in anti-Semitism, as you'll see, and many instances of scapegoating fall under this trope. So whether it's economic crises or wars or even the Black Plague, this trope says that Jews are the ones who orchestrated them. The picture you see here is a well-known anti-Semitic cartoon suggesting that Jewish people stick their tentacles, i.e. have control over, all over the world. And any Jew in a position of power is said to be evidence of this trope. Someone that comes up quite often here is George Soros, who is a Hungarian Jewish billionaire and philanthropist who's vilified by his home country for his progressive stances around things like immigration and criminal justice reform. Another example of this, a devastating one, is the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. In the early 20th century, this was a document that emerged as purported notes from supposed secret meetings of Jewish leaders who were conniving to take over the world. And these notes laid out exactly how these Jewish leaders planned to do it. It was later determined that these meetings, surprise, surprise, never actually happened, and the protocols were actually fabricated by Russian secret police as a way to scapegoat Jews. But by the time this was discovered, the damage was already done. Russia used the protocols to scapegoat Jews for the widespread poverty that was happening at the time. Henry Ford, published sections of the protocols in his newspaper in the 1920s, and the protocols heavily influenced Nazi ideology. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion has been translated into many languages and sold millions of copies. It's one of the most widely distributed anti-Semitic publications in modern society, and you can still purchase it today. This trope is also why some people refer to Jewish people as globalists or the cosmopolitan elite. This is one of many dog whistles that you may come across that if you didn't know any better, you wouldn't really think twice about. But it's actually a deeply anti-Semitic reference to the Jewish people. This next trope, greed, purports that Jews are greedy, miserly, and ruthless in their pursuits of wealth. And it also suggests that in their pursuits of wealth, they will cheat anybody, even their friends, out of their hard-earned cash. And what's interesting about this trope is that Jews were frequently associated with money because that was often the only kind of job that they were allowed to even have. Many societies placed restrictions on occupation, land ownership, etc. on Jews, and jobs handling money were some of the only jobs left oftentimes. In fact, some Christian societies specifically recruited Jews for jobs such as creditor, since Christians weren't allowed to hold that kind of job. However, because Jews were so often the people in charge of money, it made it that much easier for those same societies to scapegoat Jews when the economy was struggling. These things put together leads to the assumption that Jews are always wealthy. In France, in 2006, a 23-year-old Mizrahi Jewish man named Ilan Halimi was kidnapped and tortured by a gang in Paris who was hoping to gain thousands in ransom money from his family. The gang members later specified that they had no knowledge of Ilan's family's financial standing. They did know that Ilan and his family were Jewish, and so they assumed that his family would be rich, and so they asked for a ransom in exchange for Ilan, and they assumed that his family would be able to pay the ransom immediately. But the Halimi family was actually very much middle class. Ilan worked as a cell phone salesman, and after 3 weeks of torture, Ilan died from his injuries. This trope, disloyalty, claims that Jews are only loyal to each other, /Israel, /the Zionist agenda. And this, the trope argues, means that Jews have dual loyalties, are inherently disloyal to the country that they live in, and thus can't be trusted. This has been used to debate whether Jews were even worthy of civil rights because it was assumed that they would never be loyal to the country they lived in, and therefore they couldn't be trusted with things like military service or even voting. One of the most famous examples of the disloyalty trope is the Dreyfus Affair of the late 1890s. Albert Dreyfus was a Jewish officer in the French army who, despite a lack of evidence against him, was suspected to be a spy, went to trial, was found guilty, and then was sentenced to life in prison. And a large part of his trial was based on the disloyalty trope. And the trial was very publicized, and it, I think, revealed the European public's deep mistrust of Jews because of how the public turned against Dreyfus. When the true spy was discovered and charged, after a failed cover-up attempt, mind you, Dreyfus was put on trial again and was then again found guilty. It took another 7 years for Dreyfus to be exonerated. The term deicide refers to the myth that Jews killed Jesus, and in a more general sense, has inspired related myths of Jews out for Christian blood, but that's on the next slide. This trope has been used to justify violence against Jews for centuries. And I'd like to make it clear that the Jews did not, in fact, kill Jesus, and this has been debunked by historians and Christian leaders alike. The Catholic Church even officially discredited Jewish deicide in 1964, but this myth has persisted despite. I don't know if any of you remember a while back, comedian Jamie Foxx came under fire for tweeting, quote, "They killed this dude named Jesus. What do you think they'll do to you?" Unquote. Clearly invoking the deicide trope. It later came to light that "they killed Jesus" is actually a common way to refer to fake friends within the Black community, likely due to the heavy Christian influences. But this is an example of how the deicide trope is perpetuated even without intention and sheds light on a theme of today's training. Anti-Semitism is insidious, and many people and groups aren't even aware of their own anti-Semitism. Okay, stay with me because this is one of the stranger tropes. Blood libel refers to the idea that Jews murder non-Jews. Many myths actually specify Christian children to use their blood to perform religious rituals or even to drink. One version of this that has gained a lot of popularity and is why you see this particular political cartoon here is that Jewish people need Christian blood to make their matzah, which is the unleavened bread that's eaten for Passover. That's the bread or cracker looking thing you see in the cartoon. When you see political cartoons involving Jewish and or Israeli people drinking blood or eating children, that cartoon is invoking the blood libel trope. The reason why I call this a strange trope is because Jews are actually forbidden from consuming any blood, let alone have rituals involving blood. In fact, they can't even have animal blood. If you've ever heard of kosher meat being better quality than regular meat, that's in part due to the fact that kosher meat has to be cleaned very thoroughly to get rid of any trace of blood. That's how seriously this rule is taken. But unfortunately, this has led to Jews historically being targeted disproportionately for crimes, particularly violent crimes involving murder of children. A famous example of this is Leo Frank, who was wrongfully convicted and charged of the murder of a 13-year-old girl who worked in a factory that he managed. He was kidnapped from the prison where he was being held and was lynched. Anti-Semitism played a significant role in the false accusations and in swaying public opinion. Leo Frank's case actually inspired the formation of the Anti-Defamation League, or the ADL, which, if you notice, is the citation for these slides, and it is cited quite often in this presentation. This last trope, denial, broadly refers to the denial of Jewish traumas. We see this most often with the Holocaust, and more recently after the events of October 7th, 2023. Yeah. The trope goes on to say that Jewish traumas are elaborate hoaxes put on by Jews for secondary gain, like reparations, or in the case of the Holocaust, convince the world to give Jews their own country. This, of course, relies heavily on the belief that Jews are somehow able to force major institutions to promote this farce, going back to the power trope. So that would mean that, you're ordering governments to construct fake concentration camps. You are having census bureaus falsify deaths, somehow convincing millions of non-Jews to repeat this exact same lie. Anti-Semites promoting this trope are convinced that the quote-unquote evidence doesn't actually mean anything. A more recent example of this trope is the denial of the October 7th massacre. Despite eyewitness and first responder testimony, autopsy reports, pictures and videos filmed by the perpetrators themselves, and the perpetrators, i.e. Hamas, quite literally saying, yes, we did that and we'll do it again, many people out there are convinced that the October 7th massacre either didn't happen or it was an elaborate play put on by the Israeli Defense Forces to gain sympathy or for political gain. Okay, again, we just covered a lot of ground. I want to check in. Please type something in the chat or unmute. Any reactions to these tropes or any questions about these tropes?
Yeah, I would just like that. I mean, they're horrible. And I think it's an example of humans' tendency or need to scapegoat, someone or someone's, for difficulties or challenges, economic, religious, political, whatnot. And Jews typically are a target of that type of thing.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I see some people reacting in the chat. Some people are familiar with these already, but still have a hard time believing them. But the outlining is definitely helpful.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you for listing them. It really just takes my breath away to just see it all together. So you can hear it. It's quite powerful and shocking, and even though it's all things I know, but just all together.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for sharing. People are sharing that they're learning things, which is excellent. Super glad to hear. Ooh, why as the smallest group are we blamed for so much? Isn't that the $1 million question, Genevieve? I think we'll get a little bit into this, but I do think a big part of this is this historic scapegoating. And I think because this has been going on for so long, that it's just sort of become a natural way for society to respond. And I think when you combine that with politics, I think it makes sense in people's heads, which is unfortunate. And that's part of why I think trainings like these are so important, is I truly think that education is the antidote to this.
Good morning. As a Jew growing up in Texas, I was taught to hide my identity so that I wouldn't, be a target for this. And I want to share that my first reaction when this training was publicized was, oh my God, that's so bold to put it out there like this. And so one, I appreciate it. And two, I'm working to get over that worry about what might happen.
Mhm. Rebecca, thank you so much for sharing. And I think that we're going to speak a lot more to what your experience has been like when we get into the second half of the training, which is about clinical implications. And we'll even talk about what the reactions to this very training or different iterations of this training have been like. So thank you so much for sharing that. All right, we're going to jump into our next section. I think this foundation has been really important because it's going to help us understand this next part of what does anti-Semitism look like. As I've said before, it can be insidious. Many people understand that the statement, "I hate Jews," is anti-Semitic, of course, but more often than not, anti-Semitism is more complex than that, and it's often much more difficult to identify. And so these next slides are going to hopefully prime your brain for being able to identify these trickier examples. Media has seen an issue where characters are coded as Jewish, and it's typically not meant as a compliment. Many consider the appearance and characteristics of a villain as being greedy or dishonest, and somehow many also have a large hooked nose and are covered in hair. Initially, these references were made very intentionally as a way of scapegoating Jews. The picture you see here is on the left from the 1933 release of Walt Disney's The Three Little Pigs. The big bad wolf is seen here disguising himself to try to trick one of the three little pigs to enter his house. He's wearing a fake nose and fake hair. Looks very sort of obviously Jewish, like a Jewish caricature. Yiddish music even played when he came on screen, and he spoke with a strong Yiddish accent. The image on the right is from the 1948 re-release, so post-World War II, for those of you keeping track. So these depictions started out as direct jabs at Jewish people, but now so much time has passed that people don't make the connection, or worse, deny that the depiction even has anything to do with Jews. These are negative Jewish stereotypes that, when contrasted with what the hero or the main character of a story looks like, suggests even subconsciously that Jews or people who are believed to look or behave like Jews are negative and should be disliked or shouldn't be trusted. This is something that has endured throughout the ages. Early examples of this trope include the character of Shylock in William Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, and the character of the witch in the fairy tale of Hansel and Gretel. More modern examples of this phenomena include Mother Gothel from Disney's Tangled, and in the world of Harry Potter, where these hairy goblins with large hooked noses are the evil, greedy bankers of Gringotts. That's the picture that you see here on the right. And this, as technology has evolved, has seeped into the internet and social media, particularly in memes, where anti-Semitic memes like the happy merchant pictured here are circulated and laughed at millions of times per second. You can see here that this character has a large hooked nose. He's very hairy. He's even wearing a Jewish head covering, a kippah or a yarmulke. And so algorithms by design promote engagement. And so we see that anti-Semitic content actually goes viral because people engage with it. Like when we saw many young adults on TikTok jump on the bandwagon of resonating with Osama bin Laden's virulent letter to America. Now, naturally, when social media websites figured out what was going on, they devised ways to automatically flag and remove anti-Semitic content. But anti-Semites' reaction to that was to just make their anti-Semitism less obvious so it wouldn't get flagged. It becomes so obscure that people don't even know that what they're sharing is anti-Semitic. Some examples of this include 6MWE, which stands for 6 million wasn't enough, which refers to this idea that 6 million Jewish deaths in the Holocaust was insufficient because the Jewish population was not eradicated. Another example of this is the triple parentheses, which is meant to be placed before and after the names of Jewish people online. Now, unfortunately, at this point, it seems like this is where social media platforms have seemingly given up on trying to remove anti-Semitic content from their platforms. In surveys done by the American Jewish Committee or Jewish Congress or AJC, people reported that when they did report anti-Semitic content online, nothing was done in nearly 40% of instances. Anti-Semites have also just simply found platforms where their more blatant anti-Semitism won't go against community guidelines. Analyses have found hotbeds of anti-Semitic activity on fringe websites like 4chan, BitChute, and Gab, where anti-Semites can and do freely post the things that mainstream social media algorithms would certainly catch. Next, we'll take a look at how anti-Semitism shows up in the news and in politics. Acts of anti-Semitism come up in the news all the time. A small selection can be seen here. It's important to keep in mind that anti-Semitic events in the news, whether it's Kanye West or synagogue bomb threats, are more than just passing headlines for Jewish people. It informs them that their community is unsafe for them. However, the news is also known for having a strong bias against Jews, especially when it comes to how media reports on tensions in the Middle East. That's in and of itself a whole separate lecture, but what I am going to focus on is how news outlets and journalists can foment anti-Semitism. It's all too easy to invoke anti-Semitic tropes in the news, particularly when discussing Israel. We've talked about scapegoating a couple times. For some reason, as long as the Jews have existed, society has found a way to blame the Jew. This, along with dehumanizing Jews and Israelis, contributes to the justification of violence against Jews, not just in Israel, but around the world. The news can also perpetuate anti-Semitic tropes such as blood libel and greed by suggesting that Jews are generally untrustworthy. Is it sounding familiar from before? By making generalizations and painting Jews as thirsty for Christian or Palestinian blood, or by suggesting that Jews act only for secondary gain. The news can, intentionally or unintentionally, stoke the fire of anti-Semitism in the general public. For example, Al Jazeera is the first English news channel to be centered in the Middle East, and it's known and renowned for comprehensive frontline reporting in the Middle East, including the conflict between Palestine and Israel. However, Al Jazeera also has a well-documented history of anti-Semitism in its reporting, including, but not limited to, creating Holocaust denial content and hosting on-air celebrations of individuals who have been convicted of murdering Jews and Israelis. This all contributes to bias and false reporting in the news, which can be thought of as analogous to propaganda. And according to the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, news mediums, such as radio and newspaper, were frequently used as tools to spread anti-Semitic propaganda under Nazi rule. And so this in turn made it easier for citizens to turn a blind eye to Nazi persecution. Now, since the Holocaust, this has only gotten worse thanks to the evolution of technology, and it's led to the concerning phenomenon of misinformation and disinformation, one of the biggest sources of anti-Semitism in the news today. Misinformation refers to spreading false information with or without the intent to mislead. And disinformation refers to false information being spread intentionally to mislead. I think a lot of people can resonate with the fact that it has been really hard to learn about the Middle East because of never really knowing what's accurate, what news sources are reliable, what kind of biases people might have, etc. And both of these fan the flames of anti-Semitism, especially in times of war. A very common example of this is people who've taken photos of mass destruction or violence from other wars and repurposed them by saying that the image is actually from the current damage that Israel is doing to Palestine. Okay, now another major source of anti-Semitism in our society is in the related field of politics. We're going to take a look at anti-Semitism in conservative and right-wing spaces first before looking at left-wing spaces. And I do want to clarify that this in no way means that all conservatives are anti-Semitic. We're just looking at common ways that anti-Semitism can manifest in right-wing spaces. So the narrative that the right has about Jews falls in pretty cleanly with the anti-Semitic tropes that we covered earlier. That Jews are greedy, untrustworthy, anti-nationalist cheats trying to replace the superior Aryan or white race by pretending to be white. You might have heard this referred to as replacement theory. And so thus, right-wing anti-Semitism concludes, Jews must be eradicated because they are the cause of all the world's problems. After hearing that, it might also not surprise you to learn that right-wing anti-Semitism is also deeply intertwined with white supremacy. In his documentary, Viral, Anti-Semitism and Four Mutations, Andrew Goldberg interviews a former white supremacist who tells the camera that their strategy for recruiting new members was to identify what was wrong in a person's life and then to find a way to blame it on the Jews. Right-wing anti-Semitism is also strongly influenced by certain Christian ideologies, which posit that Judaism is a more primitive, less refined version of Christianity, and that Jews are, as a result, clearly inferior. Right-wing anti-Semitism often does not try to hide. It's plain as day, it's generally pretty easy to see, and perpetrators love playing the denial game when confronted with the fact that they're being anti-Semitic. Donald Trump was the textbook example of this phenomenon when he refused to condemn anti-Semitism, yet loved to pander to Jewish constituents and claim that he couldn't possibly be anti-Semitic because his daughter and son-in-law were Jewish. And spoiler alert, just like you can be homophobic even if you're part of the LGBTQ+ community or are close to someone in the LGBTQ+ community, you can absolutely be anti-Semitic even if you are or are close to someone who is Jewish. Now, when it comes to Israel, that gets a little more complicated because of the connection between conservative politics and Christianity. In right-wing spaces, Israel is looked upon favorably because of Christianity's own connection to Israel, to the point where it's philo-Semitic, or having a special interest in Jews, which is a different problem altogether. In addition, Jews in Israel means that there are fewer Jews in the US. And so in this strange way, we generally see Republicans and conservatives supporting the existence of Israel. Like I said, right-wing anti-Semitism may be something you were already familiar with or have seen for yourself, especially if you're familiar with Trump's election campaign and presidency. The other side of the coin, left-wing anti-Semitism, is something you might have heard less about. In fact, it might even seem counterintuitive because so much of left-wing politics is about opposing things like anti-Semitism. In that documentary that I mentioned, Viral, Anti-Semitism and Four Mutations by Andrew Goldberg, he explains it as such. Anti-Semitism does not care who it infects. It spreads so insidiously it can actually sicken the very people who believe they stand against it. Left-leaning individuals champion themselves as defenders of the rights of all and crusader against all isms. Unfortunately, they're not immune to their own anti-Semitism, although it does look very different from right-wing anti-Semitism. And just like with right-wing anti-Semitism, I also want to proceed with the disclosure that I'm not saying that all liberal-leaning folks are anti-Semitic. We're just looking at common ways anti-Semitism can manifest in left spaces. left-wing anti-Semitism often stems from the desire to identify and support marginalized groups. However, this is also part of why the question of whether Jews are white has become a very popular question. Modern left-wing anti-Semitism takes many pages out of the book of the Soviet Union's 20th century virulent and deeply anti-Semitic campaigns against Jews and Zionism, where right-wing anti-Semitism insists that Jews are not white because Jews are inferior. Left-wing anti-Semitism insists that Jews must be white because they do not experience racism. Because in America, where so much oppression and marginalization has been based on racism and colorism, left-wing anti-Semites cannot conceptualize the notion of Jews as victims of any kind of oppression as a result. In her book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism, Barry Weiss writes about a student who overheard her classmate refer to Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel as privileged because he was a white, able-bodied man. Now, while Wiesel certainly fits into some specific definitions of privilege, this classmate didn't consider that privilege is a concept that's dependent on societal definitions. And Elie Wiesel's lack of privilege in World War II Poland is the whole reason we all know his name and why he's a Nobel Prize winner. Deborah Lipstadt, in her book Anti-Semitism Here and Now, writes, quote, "In doublespeak worthy of George Orwell, keeping Jews out serves the goals of inclusion," unquote. It's because of this lens that when it comes to Israel, left-wing anti-Semites insist that Jews are settlers and colonizers. Never mind that it's quite literally against the definition of these words when you are indigenous to that land. The conclusion that's drawn from this is that all Jews either are or represent oppressors. And the concerning part here is that some studies, like the Kaplan and Small article that's cited below, shows that people whose political rhetoric around the Middle East was so extremely anti-Israeli that it was anti-Semitic, those people were in fact more likely to endorse anti-Semitic opinions completely unrelated to Israel. Former UK Prime Minister Tony Blair comments that although left-wing anti-Semitism is newer than its right-wing counterpart, it will often revert to the same name-calling and the invoking of anti-Semitic tropes of right-wing anti-Semitism, and it's driven by one-sidedness and ignorance. And so this leads to a very black and white way of thinking in which there's always two groups, the good guys and the bad guys. This might work very well for understanding American racial issues like redlining and slavery, but foreign policy often requires more nuance than that. And so this ends up putting Jews seeking to join leftist or progressive spaces in a tight spot, where they're forced to into a litmus test of having to either unequivocally condemn Israel and its right to exist, or be denied access to those spaces. In fact, post-October 7th, I have heard more and more Jews describe themselves as politically homeless for that reason. In what has become a classic example of the leftist anti-Semitism in the US, the DC Dyke March in 2019 banned the symbol of Jewish queer pride, which is a pride flag with a Star of David on it, because it was deemed a nationalist symbol of oppression because of its similarity to the Israeli flag. Now, the relevant context here is that the Star of David has been one of the most ubiquitous symbols of Judaism since about the 3rd century, and it's not some kind of code or reference to Israel. The only similarity between this flag and Israel's flag was that there's a Star of David in the middle. And the rationale of the event organizers was created after the same flag was forcibly removed from the same event 2 years prior in Chicago for an undetermined reason. Palestinian flags were allowed despite being one of the most restrictive places for queer people to live. And so the message that those Jews received was that it wasn't actually about the country, it was about them being Jewish. In 2017, according to the FBI, 58.1% of all religion-motivated hate crimes were against Jews. And 2017 isn't just an off year. This number has stayed between about 55% and about 75% since such record-keeping began. And what's interesting is the breakdown of where these occur. The majority of them happened in predominantly blue states. Any questions on right-wing and left-wing anti-Semitism before we move on?
Not a question, just a comment. I really appreciate that, as you talked about both right-wing and left-wing anti-Semitism, that you said, these are not broad generalizations about each specific group, like when you talked about Republicans and Christians and conservatives. I really appreciate you bringing that up, because not every Republican or Christian or conservative abides with these anti-Semitic tropes, and just bringing it out and clarifying on both sides is just so helpful. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's very important. I mean, not just, especially in this context, but in any context, to not overgeneralize, right? We shouldn't be putting broad labels on any specific group. Okay, we're going to move on. When it comes to anti-Semitism in the Middle East, it is an unfortunate fact that's backed by data that any rise in tension in the Middle East is accompanied by a rise in both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia around the world. Numbers on anti-Semitism during the 2023 Israel-Hamas war have been at an all-time high, having tripled or in some countries even quadrupled since such record-keeping began. This most commonly looks like Jewish businesses targeted or for vandalizing and robbing, physical and verbal assault of visibly Jewish individuals, and threats of violence to Jewish schools and synagogues. In the aftermath of October 7th, here are some of the things that Jews experienced around the world. A Russian airport saw an angry mob taking over the tarmac in a manhunt for Jews on an incoming flight from Tel Aviv. Jewish homes in Paris were spray painted with Stars of David in the exact same way that Jewish homes in France were marked under Nazi Germany's rule. Cornell University's kosher dining hall was shut down over violent threats to Jewish students. A Jewish family's home in Studio City, California, was broken into by a man screaming, "Free Palestine," and quite literally, "I'm going to kill you because you are Jewish." And more recently, we might have seen in Amsterdam, a modern day pogrom was happening where people were hunting down Jews in the streets. Now, I'm not completely naive in believing that nobody means to be anti-Semitic, but I do think that discourse about the conflict is where a lot of unintentional and even unconscious anti-Semitism comes up. This can look like something as simple as the words we use to address the people in charge of Israel. It's harmful to make overgeneralizations like we just talked about. The Jews, as a global population, are not responsible for Israel's government's actions. Believe me, as much as I would love to call up Netanyahu and tell him what to do, but unfortunately we don't have that ability. But by choosing to use language that suggests that we do, it can result in some of the incidents I just mentioned in leading people to believe that attacking Jews in the diaspora will somehow lead to the desired changes in the region that they want. Excuse me. Another way that anti-Semitism comes up often in this context includes double standards. Double standards, as we learned in the definitions we read earlier, are anti-Semitic. Double standards include opposing Israeli nationalism, yet lauding Palestinian nationalism, protesting how religious minorities are treated while remaining silent in other causes around the world, like the Uyghurs in China or Christians in the Middle East, promoting Palestinian rights to live in their ancestral homeland while denying Jews their right to live in their ancestral homeland, and yes, both have a claim of indigeneity to the land. Opposing Israel being formed by foreign imperialist countries, yet are okay with how countries like modern India were formed. caring about the displacement of Palestinian refugees without caring about even more massive refugee displacements in other wars, such as in Syria. Now, here's where I want to return to the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism for a moment, because, as you may recall, a strength of it is that it has more detailed examples on the line of anti-Semitism when it comes to discussing Palestine and Israel. This is a direct quote taken from the JDA on when discourse around Israel and Palestine is inherently anti-Semitic. The examples read as follows. Applying the symbols, images, and negative stereotypes of classical anti-Semitism to the state of Israel. Holding Jews collectively responsible for Israel's conduct or treating Jews simply because they are Jewish as agents of Israel. Requiring people, because they are Jewish, publicly to condemn Israel or Zionism, for example, at a political meeting. Assuming that non-Israeli Jews, simply because they are Jews, are necessarily more loyal to Israel than to their own countries. Denying the right of Jews in the state of Israel to exist and flourish, collectively and individually, as Jews in accordance with the principle of equality. I bring this up because I think it's important in answering our next question. Well, is it anti-Semitic to criticize the Israeli government? The answer is a resounding no, in theory. Let me explain. Theoretically, criticism of the Israeli government is actually very encouraged. It is very much culturally congruent for Jews and Israelis themselves to criticize their governments out of love and patriotism. Jews criticize Israel because they want it to be better. The Israeli government, like any government, is far from perfect, and like any government, absolutely deserves criticism where criticism is due. In fact, if you listen to Israeli society, you will hear loud and clear the very harsh critiques they have, especially of more controversial prime ministers, like the prime minister at the time of this recording, Benjamin Netanyahu. There have been there have been thousands of Israelis out in the streets protesting throughout the 2023 Israel-Hamas war, making their opinions loud and clear. However, the reason I give all these disclaimers in answering this question is because there are ways to go about criticizing Israel that are not anti-Semitic, and there are ways to go about criticizing the Israeli government that are anti-Semitic. For example, Israel did 9/11. Is technically a criticism of the government, but it's definitely anti-Semitic. And yet people try to shield it under the criticizing the government umbrella. You can't just say whatever you want about Israel and then hide behind but it's criticism of the government excuse. Think about China, for example. There are many rightful critiques of the Chinese government to be made for things like its treatment of Uyghur Muslims, as I mentioned earlier. But if somebody made racist comments about the Chinese government or Chinese people under the guise of criticism, what would we do? Would we excuse it as criticism of the government? No, I hope not. We would call that person out or in. And so in sum, it's not inherently anti-Semitic to criticize the Israeli government, but there are certainly anti-Semitic ways to go about doing that. A rule of thumb that you can use to determine whether criticism of the Israeli government falls under the anti-Semitism umbrella is the 3Ds rule developed by Natan Sharansky: demonization, double standards, and delegitimization. Some of these concepts we've already discussed, and so will hopefully feel familiar. Demonizing refers to suggesting that Jews or Israelis are evil, that they control the world, use blood libels, etc., thus dehumanizing them. Double standards is when the rules applied to criticizing Israel are applied selectively and not to other countries. For example, the double standards that we talked about before, like that no other country is told it should not exist because of the actions of its objectively bad leader and or government. Finally, delegitimization refers to denying Jewish indigeneity and the Jewish right to self-determination. And this is not mutually exclusive with Palestinian indigeneity and self-determination. Here, delegitimization specifically refers to denying Jewish indigeneity and self-determination. Whew, okay, deep breaths, everybody. You know, I really wish that I had the time to answer this question in more depth because it's an incredibly complex question fraught with painful emotions for anyone who's directly impacted by these concepts. And my answer to the question of whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism is that it's going to be another "it depends" answer, because there are unfortunately many definitions of Zionism and anti-Zionism out there that have evolved from their roots as ways to describe stances with or against political movements. In fact, Jews themselves can't even agree on what definitions of Zionism and anti-Zionism are. The basic definition of Zionism, even before the State of Israel existed, was this: Zionism meant belief in the Jewish right to self-determination, the right of Jewish people to live in their ancestral homeland. And again, this definition is not mutually exclusive of Palestinian self-determination. This definition is also the definition that the overwhelming majority of Jews accept around the world and in the United States. Within the last century, this word has been used to refer to Jewish self-determination, the political movement of giving Jews a homeland and the cost of that, support of the Israeli government, and more. And again, the data has shown that the majority of Jews identify as Zionist in the sense that they believe in that Jewish self-determination. And the overwhelming majority of Jews feel some kind of connection to that land. This majority group also believe that anti-Zionist Jews represent fringe or tokenized groups because so much of the Jewish religion is deeply tied to its indigeneity and to this specific land. Conversely, anti-Zionist Jews believe that indigeneity and religious expression are not related, and they reject a need for self-determination. The most common rationale for this, according to anti-Zionist groups, is because of the socio-political circumstances around modern pushes for Jewish self-determination. More on that in just a second. And so instead of attempting to define anti-Zionism and whether or not particular interpretations are anti-Semitic, in the interest of our time and our learning objectives, I am going to focus on when anti-Zionism, regardless of the theory and argument behind it, does result in anti-Semitism. A clear example of when anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism is when you see evidence of that double standard. So if you're calling for the destruction of a country where half the world's Jews live, and those inhabitants forced removal from their ancestral homeland, especially when the same demand is not made of other countries whose governments are also doing some messed up things, that's textbook anti-Semitism. Another example is denying the fact that Jews have ancestral ties to the land and are indigenous to the land as a way to delegitimize Jewish and/or Israeli claim to the land. This is anti-Semitic because Jewish indigeneity has been proven historically, archaeologically, etc. And denial of this fact generally comes with the explanation that the Jews planted evidence or that Jews control the major bodies that reported these findings, etc., which goes back to our tropes. Now, it is important to acknowledge an uncomfortable aspect of modern political Zionism that we don't talk about often enough, which is a major component of the argument of anti-Zionism. And it's something that we would be remiss to not acknowledge in this space. It's the immeasurable harm that was done to Palestinians in modern pushes for Jewish self-determination. Many were killed and more were forcibly displaced to make room for Jewish refugees in what Palestinians call the Nakba, meaning the catastrophe. This was the latest edition of a cycle spanning centuries, where Jews and Palestinians essentially take turns laying violent claim to and thus evicting each other from the land. We've learned that it's not inherently anti-Semitic to criticize the Israeli government, but it easily can be. And so similarly, anti-Zionism can easily become anti-Semitism, especially without prior knowledge of how anti-Semitism works, and especially if people are working on different definitions of anti-Zionism. For example, why is it that protesters claiming to target Zionists are only targeting Jewish Zionists, when many non-Jewish Zionists, especially Christian Zionists, loudly and proudly exist? We'll now go through some examples to illustrate the point that it is insufficient to take an anti-Zionist stance with a disclaimer that you're not trying to be anti-Semitic. One must learn about anti-Semitism in order not to perpetuate it. This is a tweet where the user is saying, quote, "Don't buy anything that says certified kosher. You're just enriching some Israeli, not 1 penny to them," unquote. You'll notice that this tweet was made about 2 months into the 2023 Israel-Hamas war. Now, my assumption here is that the poster was encouraging the boycotting of certified kosher foods as a way of boycotting Israel and its policies. This is an example of anti-Zionism being anti-Semitic because this actually invokes a known anti-Semitic conspiracy known as the kosher tax conspiracy theory, which claims that the costs of kosher certification is a front, and that the funds actually go to Jewish, Zionist, or Israeli causes. In reality, the process of certifying food as kosher is important for not only the thousands and millions of Jews who observe kosher laws, but also for groups like Muslims, Seventh-day Adventists, and even people with allergies and food sensitivities who may observe similar restrictions. Furthermore, the quote-unquote profit that is made from this work is so small that a representative of the Heinz company said that it literally could not even be calculated. It was that many hundredths, thousandths, etc. of a penny. Okay, this next one is an extreme example of something that happens quite often. Jewish events on college campuses being interrupted by anti-Israel protesters. I'm going to show you a video taken just days after the terror attacks of October 7th. And the video shows Jewish students in New York coming together praying for the hundreds who were killed and taken hostage. Now, one of Judaism's most important values is the preservation of life. And so anything around death and danger is taken very seriously. In the video, you're going to hear and see Jewish students reciting a prayer called the Kaddish, which is a deeply meaningful prayer of mourning. In the background, you will see and hear anti-Israel protesters loudly chanting, quote, "Resistance is justified when people are occupied, free, free Palestine," unquote. An organizer and attendee of the vigil, Ariel Homanufar, reported, quote, "On the first day back at school after the October 7th attacks, we held a vigil to mourn. We went through all the proper university channels in planning the vigil. While we were saying Kaddish, Students for Justice in Palestine, or SJP, started protesting and shouting at us. Their chants were so loud we could barely hear ourselves reciting the Kaddish." This is an example of anti-Zionism becoming anti-Semitism because in addition to this being an objectively disrespectful disruption of a vigil and a prayer, these protesters appear to be conflating Jews and Israel. Anti-Israel college groups are known to watch the event calendars of Jewish student groups as a way to find out about events to protest at. They chose an event that was not politically affiliated. This wasn't an anti-Palestinian speaker or a fundraiser for the Israeli Defense Forces or anything like that. This was a group of Jewish students trying to do what Jewish people do in honoring other Jewish people whose lives are in danger. Protesting Jews doing Jewish things when the intention is to protest Israel is anti-Semitism. Any questions or reflections on what we've covered so far?
I'll just comment on the video that you showed. As a person of faith, I'm not Jewish, I'm an ally. I'm a Christian minister. It is so profoundly disrespectful when they were praying and saying the Kaddish. I'm sorry, I didn't pronounce that right. For the protesters to completely drown out this very honest way of mourning the dead. It just breaks my heart. It's so disrespectful. Should never be tolerated.
For sharing that. Yeah, it's a pretty upsetting thing. Any other reflections or questions on what we've covered so far? All right, sounds good. On that note, it is time for our break. And when we come back, we'll talk about the implications of anti-Semitism and how what we just talked about can impact clients and patients, and how it can impact us as mental health professionals. When are we coming back?
About 5 minutes.
5 minutes. All right. See y'all soon.
Thank you.
All right, I believe it's time for us to come back together. Give folks a moment. All right, let's jump in. Next, we're going to talk about the impacts of anti-Semitism and what it can do to a person. And before we jump in, I would like to open this section with an understanding of whether and how pervasive anti-Semitism is in the United States, according to US Jews. So here I'd like to pull up our final poll question. Take a moment to answer with your best guess to the nearest percent. In the past year, how many American Jews believe that anti-Semitism is a problem in the US today? So go ahead and scroll to question number 3. We'll be answering that final question here. We'll give folks another minute, last couple seconds.
You're asking if, wait a minute, if we think 30% of US Jews think it's a problem?
Yeah, so you're taking your guess as to what percent of US Jews think anti-Semitism is a problem. Do you think it's 30% of US Jews, 50%, 75%, or 90%?
Got it. The rest of mine didn't show up. I only got 30%. Now I see it. Thanks.
Okay. All right, it looks like, scrolling down to question number 3, the majority of folks here today got it right. The answer, according to the most recent data coming out of the American Jewish Committee's yearly survey, is that a whopping 93% of American Jews surveyed believe that anti-Semitism is a problem in the US today. On top of that, 46% of American Jews say that they altered their behavior out of a fear of anti-Semitism. To understand the impacts of anti-Semitism, I think it's important to look briefly to the concept of community trauma and frame anti-Semitism as just that. For those who are unfamiliar with the term, community or collective trauma refers to a trauma that happens at a societal level and can cause both individual and collective trauma responses. Some examples of collective trauma include September 11th attacks and the American slave trade. These are traumas that affected people individually and also left indelible marks on the communities that they impacted. As I mentioned before, mostly the most well-known Jewish community trauma is probably the Holocaust. Other Jewish community traumas include the First Crusade and the destruction of the Second Temple. The events and casualties the global Jewish community experienced with the massacring, raping, and kidnapping on October 7th, 2023 is another Jewish community trauma. These traumas have been shown to go so deep as to even affect the very genetic makeup of Jewish people, known more broadly as the transgenerational transmission of trauma, or TTT. Those of you who are involved in the world of trauma or trauma work, maybe you've read books like The Body Keeps the Score, will likely not be very surprised to learn this. Collective trauma impacts traditions and teachings that are passed on through generations, and this is why it's also thought of as generational trauma. Community trauma has deep-seated influence on the community, especially when we think about how the community group attempts to protect itself from future traumas. This can be both adaptive and maladaptive. It's been found to lead to poorer outcomes, including in mental health. For example, one of the biggest impacts of Jewish generational trauma is a distrust of non-Jews. This can both protect Jews from future harm, but it can also lead to culturally normative paranoia and anxiety. Studies have shown that a significant barrier to developing resiliency as a response to community trauma is not feeling safe in the host country. And that's important to keep in mind, given what we considered earlier, or what we learned earlier, that 93% of American Jews believe that anti-Semitism is a problem in America. Very briefly, I do want to touch on general research on the impacts of discrimination as a trauma. Experiences of discrimination have been linked to increased anxiety and depression. It can increase cortisol levels, which can lead to decreased immunity against some diseases, decreased cardiovascular health, and increased participation in unhealthy coping behaviors. In my conversations with Vlad Chaikin, who is again the director on anti-Semitism programming for the ADL, he pointed out to me that we likely don't know the full impacts of anti-Semitism on mental health because we as a society simply haven't investigated it enough. I mean, even in the research that I do for these presentations, there just simply isn't a whole lot of literature directly on impacts of anti-Semitism. But here's what we do know. Experiences of anti-Semitism can lead to increased anxiety and depression. We can infer this from the research I mentioned earlier. One of the more recent empirical studies done on anti-Semitism by Cosden and colleagues found that anti-Semitism was linked to survivor's guilt and self-hatred, which is related to the concept of internalized anti-Semitism. It just feels very sad to think about. And experiencing or hearing about acts of anti-Semitism can also lead to disrupted sleep due to activation of fight or flight or trauma reactions. Anti-Semitism can also lead to body dysmorphia. I mean, think about it. If Jewish features such as a big nose, like mine, and curly hair, like mine, is stereotyped as Jewish and therefore unattractive, what message does that send to Jewish people with those features? Unfortunately, even though acts of anti-Semitism can be a galvanizing force that prompts Jews to seek community with each other, anti-Semitism can also lead to feelings of isolation instead. Because if synagogues keep getting shut down over bomb threats, as they often do, it doesn't exactly encourage Jews to congregate there. In fact, since October 7th, we've seen a relatively even split in that there are some Jews who feel even more motivated to congregate and be Jewish, but there are a lot of Jews that are experiencing a lot of fear, especially when we're thinking about the anti-Semitic attacks that have been happening. And so, if anything, this can lead to isolation from their community because they feel afraid to identify themselves as Jewish by attending a Jewish event or a Jewish space. And finally, anti-Semitism can lead to truly unsettling feelings of, like I said, feeling unwelcome and unsafe. And that rings especially true for Jews who identify as left-leaning or liberal, which happens to be a majority of Jews. And like I mentioned before, a lot of people have identified themselves since October 7th as being politically homeless in a way, in that they feel like both sides of the political spectrum reject them for different reasons for being Jewish. Any questions or reflections on this while I mute myself and cough? Okay. Now, what does this all mean? And what can we do about it? I wanted to open this section with this quote from an article by Schlosser and colleagues. They write, quote, "The literature suggests that anti-Semitism is far more pervasive and destructive than many are willing to admit or imagine, even among the counseling professions." In terms of clinical implications, Schlosser and colleagues go on to contend that anti-Semitism is one of the primary issues that American Jews face in their daily lives. This one might be kind of obvious, but anti-Semitism will impact rapport and the therapeutic relationship. Jewish patients' experiences of anti-Semitism will inevitably arise, and your response is going to impact how they feel about you. This will, in turn, impact the patient's trust in not just you, but everyone around them. The importance of an emotionally corrective experience here is huge. If your patient can't trust you to respond in the way that they need you to when disclosing an anti-Semitic experience, this is going to impact their feelings of safety in disclosing to you not just future anti-Semitic experiences, but other therapeutically relevant experiences that are unrelated to their Jewish identity. And then, of course, that opens up the can of worms of comorbidities. A depressed patient experiencing anti-Semitism is more likely to feel anxious. An anxious patient is more likely to feel depressed. An anxious patient experiencing anti-Semitism is more likely to feel anxious, etc. Whether we like it or not, anti-Semitism is likely to will impact a patient's presenting problem, which is why it's all the more important that we make space for it as a part of our care. Like with other marginalized groups, even learning about discrimination towards the community can be a traumatic experience. And so even if a Jewish person doesn't have any observable connection to the event, just being Jewish is connection enough. We've touched on the idea of the generational trauma of the fear culture before. Generations and generations of community trauma has led to this culturally normative baseline paranoia. Something that I have heard from many younger Jews in the 18 to 35-ish range is that they always heard their parents or their grandparents cautioning them about extreme anti-Semitism because they lived through or the immediate aftermath of World War II and the Holocaust. But these Jews always sort of dismissed their parents and grandparents as unreasonable paranoia until October 7th and the reactions of the world to it. And now they're realizing that their parents and their grandparents were right to be paranoid about the rest of the world. And that's just wow, like we're literally seeing the generational trauma being passed down live in HD. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism can also trigger a sort of religious existential crisis. After the Holocaust, for example, there were Jews who reported that they didn't believe in God anymore because, from their view, if there was a God, God never would have allowed the Holocaust to happen. And that is really heavy. A religious reckoning leads to increased distress, which leads to an increase in symptoms. For those Jewish Americans who are still discovering who they are, this can be a massive hindrance to identity development. How are you supposed to discover and love who you are if you're focused on hating yourself for being a Jew? How are you supposed to find your niche, your place in the world, if the world rejects you for being a Jew? This can lead to internalized anti-Semitism, which is self-inflicted anti-Semitism. Jews with internalized anti-Semitism develop at best a guilt and at worst a self-hatred for being who they are. A common theme that can come up, according to Deborah Lipstadt, is, quote, being Jewish has become a negative, a burden. If not for them, then for their friends, unquote. Next, I want to spotlight two primary sources of anti-Semitism for Jewish patients: college campuses and the workplace. The most recent data from Hillel International, which is the global organization of Jewish student unions, has found that more than half of Jewish college students feel unwelcome at their campus solely because of their Jewish identity. More than half. And data from Jewish on Campus's most recent report suggests that not only are there higher rates than ever of anti-Semitism on college campuses, but non-Jewish students are less aware of anti-Semitism as a whole compared to Jewish students. Now, the ADL has a campus anti-Semitism report card where they assessed some of the top schools in the country through 21 different criteria to understand how these institutions handled anti-Semitism. And the results are disappointing. More than 3/4 of these colleges are deficient, with more than half of the Ivy League schools earning a D. Harvard and Princeton got Fs, and Cornell got the highest grade of C. The grade of B represents better than most, a grade earned by just 20% of schools assessed. This is all really frightening, how low the standard is. Increased anti-Semitism on college campuses is certainly not new, and it's fomented by the historic exclusion of Jews from multicultural movements. I'll get to more on that in just a bit. This was really exemplified in the testimony of 3 Ivy League presidents soon after the start of the 2023 Israel-Hamas war, whose beating around the bush and flaking language on how their universities viewed and handled anti-Semitism was heavily criticized by many Jewish activists and advocacy groups, and it left Jewish students on unsteady ground. Later, over the course of the war, throughout 2024, many colleges saw encampments forming on their grounds as a form of protesting the war. And several encampments across the United States were spotlighted for discrimination and even violence towards Jewish students, at times engaging in physical assault and even physically barring Jewish students and faculty from entering campus. This left Jews feeling even more uncertain about their safety and belongingness on campus. In the workplace, many Jews report a lack of reasonable accommodations or even a lack of good faith in providing reasonable accommodations. This comes up often around Jewish holidays, where employers can be reluctant to provide time off for a holiday they don't understand, especially Some of you might know that two of Judaism's most important holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, are a mere 10 days apart. And that's on purpose. It's part of the thing. And the common response that's heard is, you just had a holiday. You can't possibly have another holiday a week and a half later. You must be making it up to get out of work. There's also reported anti-Semitism from colleagues and superiors, often unintentional, which can in turn lead to workplace dissatisfaction, stunted productivity and efficacy, stunted career growth, and increased turnover. Finally, workplaces are known for underreporting of any kind of discrimination because of barriers including HR processes, fear of retaliation, and fear of not being believed. Before I get into the implications for us as mental health professionals, I want to shed a little light on the context of the interactions between Jews and our field. Initial movements towards multiculturalism in the US focused more on race, ethnicity, and nationality. Because of this, Jews were often, surprise, surprise, lumped in the white category. Furthermore, early versions of multiculturalism didn't really consider religion in their models. This was exacerbated by early psychological theorists' views on religion. For example, Freud thought that religion was nothing more than an attempt to compensate for an unresolved father complex. And Ellis went so far as to say that religion stands against the very goals of mental health care. In response to this exclusion, as a survival mechanism, many Jews chose to assimilate in order to avoid being targeted for disagreeing with such powerful figures in the field. This was done out of a fear of being seen, identified as a potential scapegoat, as Jews have many times before, and thus persecuted. However, this resulted in Jews continuing to be excluded from multiculturalism. And the problematic relationship between psychology and Jews is something that continues today. In an op-ed by Dr. Julie Ansis, distinguished professor at the New Jersey Institute of Technology and the founder and president of Psychologists Against Antisemitism, she points out that, for better or for worse, statements made by governing bodies like the American Psychological Association and the American Counseling Association can be prone to even contradicting their own ethical principles of not inflicting harm in the statements that they release or don't release due to its leadership's own lack of education on anti-Semitism. She writes, quote, "Their statements induce a secondary trauma for Jewish people, pouring salt into the psychological wounds created by thousands of years of anti-Semitism and genocide. What happens to our world when the helpers become the perpetrators of trauma, ostensibly sensitive to the pain and suffering of some, but not others, namely Jews?" Unquote. It is still a very current problem that Jewish mental health professionals struggle with things like important meetings and conferences being held during important Jewish holidays. And still, as we saw a moment ago, Jews are still not considered a part of multicultural competencies. Some attempts to include Jews have been made, but this has led to unintentional but still harmful engaging of stereotyping. The message that Jewish people take from being excluded from multiculturalism and social justice is that the psychology world believes that Jewish people don't need or deserve mental health support. That learning about how to support them isn't important to mental health professionals because they matter less to them. That their lives have less value. I'd like to share some examples of how anti-Semitism continues to flourish in our field, starting with this very training. Almost every time I offer this training, or any of my trainings on Judaism, people have threatened to report my training to the ethics board. Their argument is that it would be unethical to have a training on anti-Semitism without also having a training on Islamophobia. While the training on Islamophobia is certainly just as important, this is anti-Semitic because it exemplifies the double standard. No other population or minority group would be required to provide a training on another group as a condition of the existence of the training for the first group. Would this happen on a training for any other minority group? It wouldn't. If this training had been about the war or about Israel, I can certainly understand their concern, especially given the blatant misinformation that's been happening on all sides. But because of the conflation of Israel with Jews, this really important training is at risk of not happening. Another example occurred in 2021 when lawsuits were filed against the Stanford University Counseling Center's DEI committee by Jewish counseling center employees. The lawsuit revealed multiple examples of the committee dismissing or omitting discussion on anti-Semitism and Jews and knowingly not responding to acts of anti-Semitism on the Stanford campus. The DEI committee's stance was summed up as such, quote, "Because Jews, unlike other minority groups, possess privilege and power, Jews and victims of Jew hatred do not merit or necessitate the attention of the DEI committee." End quote. This was problematic because in addition to perpetuating the anti-Semitic trope of power, it also falls into the trap of assuming that all Jews experience privilege while also perpetuating the idea that Jews don't belong under the DEI umbrella.
And you, just a quick question, where is that quote from?
Let me take a look at my citations. I believe it's the Reddit in 2021 article.
Yeah, but where was it? That was from somebody at Stanford, you said?
Yes, so that was Stanford University's Counseling Center,
Okay.
their DEI committee.
Okay, thank you. That's pretty disturbing. Yeah.
Yeah, it sure is. I mean, like we've been talking about, it is a problem that Jews don't belong under the DEI umbrella in the eyes of many, but it's especially problematic when this is happening at a counseling center, at a university, one of the top universities in the country, especially being in the South Bay, right? This is in everybody's backyard, where there are a lot of Jewish students and a lot of Jewish people.
Well, it's just indicative of people's difficulty to understand their own implicit biases. And education has nothing to do with that, unfortunately. Levels of education.
Yeah. I mean, we're seeing a lot of anti-Semitism coming out from people who hold doctorates, professors, really well-esteemed people in their respective fields. And I think that's part of why these trainings are so important. We'll get to this in future sections, but truly, I believe that the antidote to anti-Semitism is education.
Yeah. And I was going to add a little bit earlier, not to take much more of your time, but I work with college students, and some are Jewish, and what they're experiencing is just what you described, a tremendous amount of discomfort, and even kids who are going to college for the first year this fall and encountering these encampments and stuff on campus.
Yeah, it's been really hard. I also work at a university counseling center, and both professionally and personally, we're very much seeing people falling in sort of two sides of an extreme. One side where they're wanting to connect more with the Jewish community because they don't feel safe with non-Jewish students. But on the other side, we have students who are saying, well, it feels so unsafe to even be Jewish and identify myself as Jewish by going to Jewish events or showing up in Jewish spaces that I don't even want to engage in that because of the fear for my safety. And both of those experiences are incredibly painful to reckon with for college students. Thanks for sharing, Paul. Any other thoughts or reflections on this example? Because I got more examples, believe it or not.
Well, I agree that there are many examples in recent times, absolutely, without question. And each one is so painful, excruciatingly painful, and unbelievable in how acceptable it has become, at least in my thinking. I'm wondering if you're also going to address when the therapist is Jewish and the patient is anti-Semitic or saying anti-Semitic statements.
Mm-hmm. I have learned that I probably don't address this as much as Jewish therapists would want me to. And I think that's because it's a very difficult topic to discuss. The focus of this training is on clinical work, right? It's like how we're supporting our clients, but a part of our clinical work is also taking care of ourselves. And so I will be talking about, ways that we can take care of ourselves, different resources that are out there. But there will be a point where I will be asking, in fact, very soon, if Jewish therapists feel comfortable sharing what this experience has been like for them.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much for asking.
Okay. Well, I just, to that point, one other comment is, I do think it's not only self-care addressing an anti-Semitic statement or belief in a clinical setting when the patient's perhaps unaware of it.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps if they're more aware, they are actually very embarrassed and horrified that they're perpetuating it. So I don't think it's only for the benefit of the psychologist.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It can be such a tricky thing, and I don't think that there is a simple answer to these kinds of questions, partially because it's so complicated, but also partially because every situation is different, right? I have heard of clients coming in who, to Nanette's point, are not necessarily aware of their anti-Semitic biases. And there are also clients that very much are aware, or that maybe they don't view it as anti-Semitic, or maybe they, are aware but are okay with that. So it's very difficult, and I hope that we'll be able to address that a little bit more. Um, any other thoughts or questions on that?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to piggyback on what Nanette said. For our clients who may not realize that their stances and statements are anti-Semitic, of course, it's going to vary from client to client and be very much dependent to some degree upon their diagnosis, as well as our therapeutic alliance with them. But many times we can identify this as an opportunity for psychoeducation in a gentle, loving, but confrontational way, to let them know that what they are saying is and can be construed as hate speech. Sometimes when we frame it that way, they can go, "Oh, wait, wow, really? I didn't realize that." And sometimes that can give them an opportunity for some insight. And of course, sometimes that can invite pushback. But of course, it's going to depend. But I always try to make space to talk about these things when it's clinically appropriate.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that, Christine. We will definitely be talking more about what to do when we experience anti-Semitism, and we will be talking about, the benefits or maybe drawbacks, and things to consider when we see anti-Semitism in our clients. So if there's more conversation to be had around that, which I hope that there is, let's bring that up when we get to that slide. Does that sound good? Okay, I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves here.
I'd like to add in a different experience that I had working with a woman, a refugee from Afghanistan during October 23. And I had not disclosed to her that I was Jewish. And after the terrorist attack, I asked her, what has been her experience? Is she experiencing any prejudice and anti Islamophobia, and that took us into a conversation of me disclosing that I am Jewish, and that led to such a richness in our relationship. It was really wonderful as part of our clinical experience.
Oh, what a therapeutically beneficial use of self-disclosure. Thanks so much for sharing that, Rebecca. All right. The next example that I wanted to share with you all is something that you may have heard about, you may not have heard about. It's an example coming out of Chicago, where people were compiling a list of Zionist therapists in order to know who not to support. So in March of 2024, the message that you see here was posted in a Facebook group for Chicago mental health professionals. The post announced the creation of a list of therapists with quote unquote Zionist affiliations. In other words, a list of therapists not to support. The therapists on this list were all Jewish. Some appear to have been added to this list because they responded to a request in the group posted a little before this post for somebody seeking a referral for a patient wanting a Zionist therapist. Other people who were on this list have no idea why they were added because they'd never made statements about Zionism. And so the only conclusion that they were left with is that they were added to this list because their names were very visibly Jewish. Now, if you are Jewish or have a more intimate understanding of Jewish history and culture, you may understand the immediate reactions of fear and shock at the idea of having a list of Jewish people in negative contexts. This is problematic because keeping a list of Jews was a mechanism that has allowed groups and governments to persecute Jews, especially in Nazi Germany. And something else to keep in mind, as we discussed earlier, there are different definitions of Zionism and anti-Zionism floating around. And so there's a very good chance that the therapists on this list were targeted simply because they believe in Jewish indigeneity, which is different than their geopolitical views on the Middle East. As we discussed, the definition of Zionism that the majority of Jews endorse is not mutually exclusive with Palestinian indigeneity and self-determination. It only refers to the belief of Jewish indigeneity and self-determination. And again, as we discussed before, there's often a double standard in only targeting Zionists who are also Jewish. All of the therapists on this list were Jewish, despite there being many non-Jewish Zionist therapists, resulting in a list that was basically targeting Jews. And that's anti-Semitic. I would love for us to take a moment now, and I'm wondering if folks feel comfortable sharing either through chat or unmuting, if they themselves have witnessed or heard about or been victims of anti-Semitism within our field as mental health professionals.
Well, I can share. I mean, as one of the board members of the Bay Area Psych Association,
to sort of avoid this like cancel culture, or to like want to be sensitive to as many groups as possible, really lean into this idea of like, oh, well, we have to offer these two things together. And while it's certainly important to have both of these trainings, one doesn't need to exist as a condition of the other.
Yeah, I'll just echo what Paul said, that as a board, some of us in planning this workshop had some concern about would there be protests or blowback or something that because of the topic. So we were aware of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Barbara. And I mean, knock on wood, I've been very fortunate in that I haven't had direct disruptions to my trainings, but I do get a lot of what I mentioned before, which is people threatening to report to the ethics board, or people having concerns for not also offering Islamophobia training, things along that line. I'm seeing in the chat, folks are sharing as well. Folks have experienced anti-Semitism in workshops on diversity, some casual anti-Semitism, it looks like, people who ask, why are all psychologists Jewish? Which is both inaccurate and harmful. Christine, did I see your hand go up?
Yeah. Was it last January? I think it was earlier this year. I was at a professional conference that was doing an all-day presentation on domestic violence, which is one of the areas that people need to get additional credits in as a condition of licensure. And I wasn't in that particular workshop. I was in the room after that workshop was done, but I saw some of the flip charts that were up on the wall, and it was like listing characteristics of abusers and characteristics of victims and things like that. And on the list of things that were characteristics of victims, someone had written in, whether it was during that workshop or later was added, I'm not sure, but someone wrote on there Palestinians. And I should disclose, I'm an expert in family violence. Domestic violence is my area of expertise. But when I saw that thing equating Palestinians as victims, I felt, again, I'm an ally, I'm not Jewish. I felt as if someone had punched me in the gut, and I literally had to walk out of the room. I was so physically sickened by what I had witnessed. And this is a professional conference for psychologists. And I thought, this is not the room for this sort of political rhetoric and anti-Semitic tropes. Again, it just was very offensive.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Christine. That seems, first of all, not the appropriate place to bring politics into it, but it's also starting to get into these conversations of, there are certainly a lot of ways in which Palestinians have been hurt and have been victimized. And, we talked about the harm of like over labeling and overgeneralizing. And I think about how that can have negative impacts as well.
Yeah, I'd love to also share. I think I could talk about this for hours. And I really, first of all, I just so appreciate Paul and Barbara and everyone's support for making this happen. And I'm so grateful to Liya for being here, because I just think it's such an important topic. And I feel anxious anytime I bring it up, even, for example, to our board meeting of, hey, this is a workshop we should have. I definitely have experienced quite an increase of anti-Semitism, both clinically with certain clients that I've worked with for a long time who didn't know I was Jewish necessarily. And then also kind of, I think within our profession, it's been really challenging for me personally. I'm doing a lot of work on this right now. I'm helping create a lot of support groups around this. And one of our projects was to present at the APA conference this year on our project. And literally the title of it is just kind of providing support groups for the Jewish community. Anyway, there were so many posts going around various divisions within APA flagging our talk and asking for people to show up at the talk in protest. That the talk was almost canceled. It was literally like how to set up a support group. And the point of the talk was to generalize it to any community. And so we needed extra security. We needed extra everything. We didn't know until like 3 days before the APA convention whether we were going to do this like talk on how to support the community. And it was really, I can't even express like both the amount of fear and disappointment and distress that like came with all of that. Like my family didn't want me to go. And that's really, really sad. to say the least. So I feel like this has hit many of us in so many different ways, and I very much experience this frequently. And so I appreciate everyone showing up here. I appreciate Liya for you trying to educate as many people as you can. Yeah, that's my little 2 cents.
Sasha, thank you so much for sharing that. It is, you know, I think this is a big part of why we don't have the literature and the research that we need on understanding anti-Semitism and how it impacts Jews and non-Jews, is because of things like this and the painful consequences of conflating Jews and Israel, right? It sounds like these people were trying to protest Israel and what Israel has been doing. And yet this had only very vague connections to Israel, in that the support groups were around what was happening. And so the fact that things aimed at understanding Jewish people, at gaining competency and awareness and education around Jewish political issues is seen as something to protest, is really harmful, and it speaks to just how politicized Jewish identity has become. Thanks so much for sharing that, Sasha.
In the organization Psychologists Against Anti-Semitism, I think it's in the field, I'm not sure, but I am continually appalled at the degree, because there are continual posts and letters being pointed out, including from, people very high up in APA, and the different examples of anti-Semitism within our profession that is completely accepted. It is really horrifying and scary to me. And yeah, the list is so long, I don't even know where to begin the examples.
Yeah. Thanks for putting a voice to that, Nanette. I think something that I've heard vocalized before is that something that feels a little more unique to this fight against anti-Semitism, compared to maybe some of the fights against other isms that we're seeing, is that we're having to convince people of what is anti-Semitic, or that's bad. You know what I mean? There's a lot more normalization, especially in left-wing spaces, that typically doesn't tolerate that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing, everyone. What were you going to say, Nanette?
I was going to say one more point about how, when clients voice anti-Semitic statements, and I never want to shame them, just like friends that do, or acquaintances. I try very hard, very intentionally, how to respond. And this is with friends even, or acquaintances, because if I shame them, it's not, then I'm not listened to at all, in my opinion. Whereas if I can address it more with, pointing out, assuming that it's not obvious to them. And with patients, I find it very, very sensitive and very delicate addressing it, because it is sensitive. And I certainly don't want to be shaming a patient or making them wrong, but helping them see. And sometimes it really is a deep belief on their part, even when they do see it, they believe that. So that's I find very difficult.
Yeah.
Important and necessary, but with great sensitivity.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I'm hoping that we can have more of this conversation when we get to the part where we talk about, like, what do we do when this happens? Thank you so much for these beautiful introductions to those topics. Yeah. Okay. I think this is really helpful for us to sort of share with each other about what we've seen. It's one thing to have me to sort of lecture at you on what's come up, but I think when people can bring their own experiences or what they've seen, it makes things feel a lot more real. I want to highlight two quotes that I think should guide us in understanding the ethical implications of anti-Semitism for us as mental health professionals. Clinicians working with Jewish clients, have a duty to develop understanding of how anti-Semitism has manifested within their society historically, as well as the manner in which it persists today. Psychotherapists who hold more objectively negative thoughts or feelings about Jews have an ethical obligation to refer American Jewish clients to another psychotherapist until they have adequately addressed their own anti-Semitic thoughts and feelings. With that, let's get into it. Starting out with a general, we as mental health professionals are ethically obligated to maintain cultural awareness. So if you consciously choose to not learn about and address anti-Semitism, that poses an ethical risk. This is part of undoing the harm that has been done by excluding Jews from multicultural movements. I know that we are part of a psychological organization, and I often find that the people that attend these trainings are not exclusively psychologists. And so I'm not going to be able to whip out a specific ethics code that applies to everybody here. But I do think that you would be truly hard pressed to find an ethics code for mental health professionals that would allow anti-Semitism. In the most general sense, ethics codes stipulate that we do our best to minimize our own biases and not let them impact our clinical work. Most, if not all, ethics codes also stipulate that we respect the dignity and worth of all people and do not engage in unfair discrimination. On a practical note, allowing anti-Semitism into your clinical work means that you are at best ineffective with your patients, leading to retention issues. And at worst, you're setting yourself up for a discrimination or malpractice suit and putting your license at risk. Yes, our field pushes us to social justice work and advocacy as a part of what we do. And because of what we do, our social justice should not be causing active harm to another minoritized and oppressed group. That's a unique role that I think that we have as mental health professionals who choose to engage in social justice work. Not checking your anti-Semitism could lead to unintentional engaging of stereotyping in patients. An example that comes up often is making assumptions about the financial status of Jewish patients because of the stereotype and trope of greed that I mentioned earlier. You're almost guaranteed to lose a Jewish patient who has to correct you that they do in fact have financial struggles, right? I have heard of this coming up at times where in an intake, right, where we're collecting information about one of our new clients, you might not automatically think, oh, I should check in about, finances, if finances are a concern, because some people erroneously make the assumption like, oh, if they're Jewish, then they're probably fine. I don't need to ask about that. I hope I don't need to say more about why these things are bad. All right, on that note, before we jump into our last section for today, we are going to take our second and last break. When are we coming back from this break?
Maybe, Leah, how much time do you think we need for the last section? Like, should we take 10 minutes or?
We could do another 5-minute break.
5-minute break? Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
So maybe come back at 11:30.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Give folks a moment to come back. As we jump in to the home stretch of our training today. All right, as I have alluded to earlier, this last section is being an ally. What do we do? What can we even do? Starting out big and then zooming in, I want to highlight some social justice principles in supporting Jews and addressing anti-Semitism. And the first thing that needs to be done is to rightfully acknowledge Jews as belonging under the DEI umbrella. This looks like more trainings like these, more research on the impacts of anti-Semitism, and more appropriate responses to anti-Semitism. More on that in a few slides. I really hope that this is one of the trainings that you all remember, or one of the pieces of information that you all remember from this training. There is research coming out of the ADL that shows that the more you know about Jews and about anti-Semitism, the less anti-Semitic you are likely to be. I'll say that again. The more you know about Jews and anti-Semitism, the less likely you are to be anti-Semitic. And this really speaks volumes to how vital education and training on issues on anti-Semitism are. A lot of people have questioned how they can support Palestine while also supporting Jews. And my response to that is that they're not mutually exclusive. We shouldn't let our support of one cloud our ability to be allies for the other. Both groups deserve your allyship and support. You do not have to choose. It is possible to uphold our values around social justice by making room for both, by identifying with common humanity. And identifying with common humanity is where our jobs as mental health professionals can really be a key part of the solution. Part of our job is to mitigate harm, and our role and position in society allows us to connect with that sense of humanity on very personal and intimate levels, understand mental health impacts, and advocate for change and peace. So what do you do when you witness anti-Semitism? What do you do when someone discloses to you that they have been the victim of anti-Semitism? I do think it's important to call it out in the moment. Jewish people may feel afraid to name anti-Semitism for fear of backlash, unfair targeting, or they may just not have the energy to do so. It is crucial, though, that the anti-Semitism is named, because otherwise the connotation is that what happened was appropriate and is okay to do again. It is important that you don't do this in a way that places a spotlight on the subject of the anti-Semitism or somebody who happens to be in that space and is Jewish, so that they don't feel uncomfortable. For example, instead of saying, hey, you know Liya is Jewish, right? That was anti-Semitic and likely made her uncomfortable. You can just simply say, oh, I'm not sure if you were aware, but that was actually anti-Semitic. One major way that Jews need support in the face of anti-Semitism is to actually respond to it. Even when people feel comfortable coming forward, it is often minimized or brushed under the rug. It's important that anti-Semitism is taken just as seriously as any other act of discrimination and that you respond accordingly. Whether it's releasing a statement or offering additional mental health support or updating clinic policies, taking appropriate disciplinary action, considering additional security, etc. I have heard that this one can make some people feel uneasy, checking in on Jewish people. Whether it's a colleague or a patient, it can be incredibly reparative for Jews to know they're not alone. An almost universal comment that I have heard from the Jewish community in the wake of October 7th is something along the lines of, I feel so alone. No one at work or school has said anything about it. It's almost as if nothing is happening. Acknowledging what is going on is a small action that sends a big message to Jewish patients. one small thing that you can do is, first, if you have a personal relationship with somebody who's Jewish, you can send a message as simple as, "I'm sorry about what's happening. I'm here if you need support." That tells Jewish people that you are an ally and a safe person to go to if they need support. And again, the power of just naming what is happening is really huge and speaks to how low the bar is, unfortunately. Finally, if it's appropriate to do so, it's important that acts of anti-Semitism are reported. Because of the nature of anti-Semitism, Jews often don't report anti-Semitism because it's commonly dismissed and minimized. And so, according to a survey by the American Jewish Committee this past year, of Jews who were the subject of anti-Semitism, a staggering 79% of Jews did not report it. Jews need to be supported and made to feel safe enough to report acts of anti-Semitism as any other act of discrimination, if not to the police, then to at least to the ADL, who tracks these numbers. Barring ethical concerns like confidentiality, of course, reporting is important because it's commonly believed that these statistics on anti-Semitism are actually lower than reality because of underreporting. Now, when it comes to naming anti-Semitism that's coming from our clients, a lot of people ask me what to do about this. And I always think about this panel that I attended at the APA conference, not this past year, I believe maybe in 2022. It was a really excellent panel on addressing microaggressions in therapy. And something that they said that really resonated with me was really taking the question of whether or not to name it back to case conceptualization. And by that, I mean, sometimes it can feel unrelated to therapy to bring something up if it's not related to therapy, and it can actually damage the therapeutic rapport. However, more often than not, if we think about what's happening, it can often be connected to their case conceptualization or their presenting problem. Like, for example, if somebody is coming in because they're struggling interpersonally and they're sitting here spewing anti-Semitic or like really harmful rhetoric, that would be a really important thing to name of, hey, I wonder if maybe this is a piece of what's going on, of why you might be struggling interpersonally, right? And so I'm always very cautious about addressing things like this in session, because I've seen the other side where there are anti-Semitic therapists who have shared in forums about how sad they feel for their clients who identify with Israel, or their clients who are Zionist, and like really sort of pathologizing that idea. And so for that reason, I can feel a little bit hesitant on what to do when anti-Semitism or rhetoric that we might disagree with comes up. And I really like to bring it back to the case conceptualization, right? We can apply our 3Ds rule to determine, is this anti-Semitic? And if it is there a way through the case conceptualization that this feels relevant to discuss with our clients? What do other people think about this idea?
It's interesting to me, naming it anti-Semitism, as in, it seemed like that's where it started, rather than, I'm not quite sure what their religion, her being Jewish, has to do with, blank, 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 when you didn't mention other people's religion. Like addressing more the content as an initial step and working from there. And maybe there's more value to just saying, do you realize that's anti-Semitic? But I think there's a lot of assumption in that we understand, especially when we're seeped in this world. But for other people who don't, that may be a really big step to, well, how's it anti-Semitic that I don't agree with blank, blank? So that's just a comment that I have about what you were saying.
Oh, certainly. That was just an example that I brought up.
Yeah.
I really do agree with you in that it's important to sort of try to ground our intervention in something that doesn't have to be tied to like a certain person, that is just sort of really grounded in, all factual observations.
But I do think calling it out is important. Again, I think the way we do it, because if part of therapy is to help a person see what they're not seeing that's getting in their way, then I think anti-Semitism, conscious or unintentional, is part of that.
Yeah, I mean, I keep thinking about like the case conceptualization, right? And people have different goals for therapy, certainly based on modality, based on presenting problem. And so I often find that even if people don't necessarily have that specific goal in mind for therapy, there's often a goal in there that feels connected to addressing biases. Thanks for sharing, Annette. Any other thoughts?
I'd like to speak as a existential humanistic therapist. Some of you may be familiar with the writing of Irving Yalom, who talks about the here and now and utilizing the here and now in therapy with clients. So if things like this come up in therapy, sometimes I will share with the client my own reaction to their statement, just like I shared my reaction to that thing that happened at the conference. Sometimes people don't understand how their actions are affecting other people. And if you try to attack their actions head on, they can get very defensive. But if you share with them, this is how your statement or your action affected me, then you can tap into their empathy if in fact they are empathetic at all, right? And if you've got a good therapeutic alliance, it usually is tolerated and received pretty well. But for them to realize this is how your actions are affecting me as your therapist, I wonder if perhaps this is also happening in your relationships outside the therapy. Again, it's an opportunity for potential insight.
Thanks for sharing, Christine. And as you were talking, I found myself reflecting, wow, that really is a very humanistic response. Yeah, very well said. Thank you. Okay, I do want to highlight a note on the importance of believing Jews from a trauma perspective. Anti-Semitism is no exception to the rule that disclosure of trauma can and does often result in not being believed or delegitimization. The trope of denial that has been of severe detriment to Jews for so long has led to this almost a sort of Jewish rejection sensitivity where Jews almost expect not to be believed, and this causes significant harm. And this trope has also led to generally not believing Jewish reports or disclosures of discrimination or of harm, which is a double standard. We're seeing this painfully play out in real time with the sexual violence that happened on October 7th. Our society has been making wonderful strides more and more towards believing survivors, but suddenly the world doesn't believe Jews when they are raped, assaulted, and horrifically sexually abused. This has led to the unfortunate but accurate hashtag #MeToo unless you're a Jew, which is a play on the #MeToo movement. From the research world on sexual trauma, we know that experiences of not being believed adversely impacts a survivor's healing, leading to compounded trauma and additional negative impacts like loss of institutional and systemic trust, as well as decreased self-worth and self-esteem, and increased self-blame. Fortunately, the research also informs us that legitimizing responses can improve outcomes, so it's really important to believe our Jewish clients. Which leads me into my next slide. Some of you might be asking yourselves, okay, well, how can I support my patients who are Jewish? The literature highlights the need to create a sense of safety in the face of collective trauma. In the room, this looks like creating space for their Jewish identity while still allowing them to define it. As we learned earlier, there are many ways to be Jewish, and so it's important to affirm that your therapy is a space where it's safe for them to talk about being Jewish and what that means for them without making assumptions about what their Jewishness is. Something that I've often heard from mental health professionals is a sense of discomfort in how to bring this up. And I'd like to remind you all that while broaching, which is bringing up concepts around diversity with patients, can be uncomfortable for the clinician, the research really does support the importance of this in a therapeutic relationship, and that broaching often goes well. The next step, as we discussed a moment ago, is to believe what they say. This is indescribably crucial for therapeutic spaces, not just for building therapeutic rapport, but also in making your clients feel safe and really advancing their therapeutic goals. In order to affirm Jewish clients, you need to believe them. Following that, you should care about what they've been through. It's one thing to believe them, and it's another to really authentically feel that pull. If you're able to tap into this, it can be a really powerful, emotionally corrective experience for clients. Not to mention it can be a tool for addressing internalized anti-Semitism. These things will all build the therapeutic rapport, which is something that we know is one of the most crucial ingredients to successful therapy. This one might be obvious, but doing the work. The bar is disappointingly low when it comes to Jewish people's expectations of non-Jews for knowledge about Judaism and anti-Semitism. Patients will feel so affirmed if you're able to do basic things like know what their major holidays are and when they're coming up. And I'm not saying that just because it will affirm Jewish patients. Again, that research coming out of the ADL, it's shown that learning about anti-Semitism reduces your own anti-Semitism. And this in turn makes your therapeutic space safer for Jewish patients. In fact, just by showing up and engaging in this training, you have already done so much to reduce your own anti-Semitism and affirm your Jewish patients. And so for that, I thank you. And of course, part of the work includes doing your own work. As uncomfortable as it can be to confront your own privileges and your own biases, this is a key part of being able to truly understand anti-Semitism. And this also includes embracing your own humility. A great example of this actually comes from my own life. When I started working with a new therapist, I told her about my identity, and I mentioned that I do these trainings as a part of my career. And she sort of thought about this for a second, and she said something along the lines of, I feel like I have a lot to learn about Jewish people and about Judaism, and I don't want our time together to just become a space where you educate me. So I don't want you to feel like pressure to answer a certain way because of the power dynamic, but I would be interested in attending one of your trainings if you felt comfortable having me. This was honestly one of the best ways that she could have responded. And as a patient, I felt really cared about and seen. And I hope this story is motivating to you. If the therapist of the presenter of this CE could have the cultural humility to acknowledge her need for additional education, then you can do it too.
Liya, I'd just like to say that, I'm not Jewish, but do
Yeah.
have Jewish clients. And part of my intake with people is to ask if they're comfortable, with me as a therapist, not being from their whether it's their religion, their culture, not speaking their native language fluently. And also, asking them to please, if they do choose to work with me, despite that, to educate me about the things that I'm not necessarily aware of. So, I think, when I was teaching, I would always, I have a bias. I don't think you can teach cultural, what's the course week? I know ethnic or cultural sensitivity or whatnot. It's hard work.
Multiculturalism.
Yeah, multiculturalism, or Palo Alto University, there were several professors who used to teach on learning to be a cultural competence. And my bias is that we have to acknowledge that we are competent in perhaps one or very few cultures and stuff, and recognize that, acknowledge it to our clients, see if they're comfortable working with us, and if they are, be humble about having them educate us about the issues that are important to them. And that builds, as you just pointed out, a therapeutic alliance that's important.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Paul. Other thoughts on this before we move on? Okay. Yes.
I hope I'm not talking too much, but I wanted to piggyback on what Paul had said. In my training, I was informed that rather than asking the patients to educate us, that we should take it upon ourselves to educate ourselves about their community.
Mhm.
I hope what I just said isn't offensive to you, Paul. I'm just talking about the way that I was trained. So I take a very proactive role in trying to educate myself about different communities I don't know anything about. Like years ago, I had an editing client who was writing about the transgender community, and I realized, oh, this is not an area of competency for me. And as an editor, you would think, oh, that wouldn't even matter. But I'm also a psychologist in training, right? And I thought, I really need to learn about this community. So even though it was not required as an editor serving this particular student on his dissertation, I went to the library and got like 12 different books on transgender experience, not just the research, but also the lived experience. So I could try to understand some of the nuances. And I'm really glad that I did, because it was very helpful in the editing as well. But I also think it made me better as a clinician. And I do the same in other different communities. So learning about the Jewish community, the experience of anti-Semitism, learning about the experience of various Native American tribes and how to be more multiculturally competent. In addition to being culturally humble in the room with the patients, but I don't want to put the responsibility for educating me on them, as I think that would, to me personally, not be ethical. I'm not saying for anyone else, but for me personally.
Well, I think that there's truly a middle ground between what both of you are sharing, and I think Jews specifically are a really great example of this, because as we learned, there are so many ways to be Jewish. And so you can do things like learn the absolute basics of Judaism, right? And also, you're not going to show up with your client and say, I know all about you and about how your Judaism is because I've taken these trainings and I've read these books, right? And so I think there's absolutely both and kind of mentality to it, where yes, we should be doing our own work outside of these spaces to learn what we can, and also having the humility to say, I might know about this, but I still don't know about you and your experience and what parts of these feel relevant for you, what parts of these you experience. I definitely see the importance of holding both philosophies. Thanks for sharing. All right, in the interest of time, I am going to move us along. These are my recommendations for more specific clinical interventions for clients who might be struggling with anti-Semitism. This is based on both the current literature of what is out there, as well as my own experiences working with Jewish clients. You might notice that many of these recommendations do have overlap with trauma treatment recommendations, and that's not an accident. Much like racial trauma, Jewish experiences around anti-Semitism should be considered an identity-based trauma around discrimination. This might seem basic, but I cannot stress enough the importance of thorough trauma assessment. This is not only important for you, the therapist, in understanding your client's experiences, but this also serves as modeling. Jewish clients, unfortunately, often assume that their therapists, particularly non-Jewish therapists, don't prioritize their Jewish identity or their experiences with anti-Semitism. When you're able to define the boundaries of your therapeutic space as explicitly caring and wanting to know about those experiences, it can help your client feel more comfortable about opening up about them. You should not assume that your client will simply tell you when they're ready if you don't invite the conversation first and name that space. In addition to your own intake interview, there are established measures that you may find useful, such as the cultural formation interview, as tools for getting a comprehensive picture of what your client experiences. I have found values work to be especially important, but that's just cognitive restructuring. How about cognitive restructuring? I think that there is a lot to be said about the ability to really reassess what Jewish clients are thinking about their experience. And so part of this, I think, it's a very useful tool when their experiences of anti-Semitism have led to negative impacts on their view of self, others, and the environment, or if they're experiencing internalized anti-Semitism. And this is also, to somebody's point before, where psychoeducation is especially important in helping clients understand the impact of their environment and systemic flaws of the environment on their experiences, right? So it's not your fault that you experience anti-Semitism, it is the environment's fault for not protecting you from that. Values work, there we go, is especially important when supporting clients through anti-Semitism. And by that, I mean, there are different ways to respond to anti-Semitism for like Jewish clients, emotionally speaking. So for example, some Jews will react to experiences of anti-Semitism with an overwhelming desire to engage in advocacy. More on that in a bit. Others' first priority will be establishing a sense of safety for themselves, and others still will think about their community and how to take care of the community. I could go on. Working with your client to clarify their values in how they want to respond to anti-Semitism can provide them with a sense of empowerment and autonomy. I've also found particular DBT strategies to be helpful. One that I particularly want to highlight is coping ahead, which is creating a game plan for coping with anti-Semitism before it occurs. And so creating such a plan can not only increase a client's sense of safety, but it can also restore a sense of control for them. I also find the DBT module of distress tolerance in a general sense to be beneficial for Jewish clients. This module, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is all about developing skills to provide short-term relief when emotions become too overwhelming. I have found particular success with the tip skill and the improve skill. I do think there's something particularly therapeutic for Jewish clients when they're able to have a space to simply process what's going on. And I don't want anyone to underestimate how powerful it can be to just simply provide that space for them and have that be an intervention. Keep in mind that Jews are in a unique position where their trauma, like we talked about, isn't necessarily seen as trauma by others around them, or worse, their disclosure of trauma will put them at risk for more trauma. And so it is so emotionally corrective to just simply have a space where they can talk through what they've been going through and for that vulnerability to be held and received. Clients might not even have other opportunities to process for the reasons I just mentioned. And so it's vital that therapy can be that space for them to be open and honest about their experiences. And as I mentioned at the beginning of our time together, which feels like forever ago, there is so much emphasis on community and doing good in Judaism. And so in a general sense, activism and advocacy are pretty common responses to identity-based trauma as a way of finding meaning and purpose in the face of such awful experiences. And for Jews specifically, supporting their community and turning their pain into purpose is very much culturally congruent. And furthermore, one of the primary recommendations in the face of identity-based trauma, generally speaking, is to connect with community. And this is doubly true for Jews whose culture already places such significant emphasis on community. One of my questions for Vlad, who again is the ADL's National Director on Programs for Anti-Semitism, was, how can mental health professionals be allies? And he told me two main points that I want to highlight and share with you all. One, he said, is the importance of mental health professionals calling in and educating other mental health professionals. We tend to listen to other people in our field more than people who are outside of our field. And so it's also easier for us to see anti-Semitism happening in our field because we are in it ourselves. And so we have a unique role, specifically in mental health, in calling in or identifying anti-Semitism within the field to other mental health professionals. The other main point that Vlad had was a point that I already mentioned, and I'm saying it again to really drive it home. It is so, so important to do the work, to learn about us, to learn about anti-Semitism. Vlad had a quote that really resonated with me that I share every single training. You cannot combat what you cannot define. And as we just learned in the last slide, learning about anti-Semitism reduces anti-Semitism. And so we need to educate ourselves on what it is and what it isn't in order to fight it. A takeaway that I hope that you have from this training today is that anti-Semitism is not a cut and dry concept. It is insidious, it is chameleonic. Another great Vlad quote that I really like he said, "Anti-Semitism dresses for the occasion." Anti-Semitism is easy to spot when it shows up in cargo shorts to a black tie occasion, but anti-Semitism is typically really, really good at following the dress code. And so if we're going to fight it, we need to learn to identify it with methods more reliable than whether or not it's blatantly obvious. I hope that this training has galvanized you in some way. For those of you who are wondering where to go from here, I have got you covered. The resources sent out for this training includes a resource list of other ways to engage and learn more. From that resource list, I've highlighted 3 different pieces of media that you can consume. Again, I promise I'm not sponsored in any way. I just really, really enjoy these works and really want to share them with you. For those of you who enjoy books, I cannot recommend enough the book Antisemitism Here and Now by Deborah Lipstadt. I've cited this book several times over the course of today's training. In addition to being let me make sure I get this right, the United States Special Envoy for Monitoring and Combating Antisemitism, she is also the Dolot Professor of Modern Jewish History and Holocaust Studies at Emory University. So in other words, her voice is extremely well qualified and it's an excellent read. As a side note, if you are a reader but are not yet ready to commit to an entire book, I highly recommend Harvard Law professor Noah Feldman's essay in Time magazine called The New Antisemitism, which is linked in my resource list. For those of you who are more visual and or enjoy watching TV, I recommend the documentary Viral: Antisemitism in 4 Mutations. You have heard me cite this over the course of the presentation as well. It's written and directed by the Emmy Award-winning Andrew Goldberg. It is a really excellent, eye-opening watch. And finally, for those of you who enjoy doom scrolling on social media, @RootsMetals on Instagram is truly the foundation of Jewish advocacy on social media. Debbie is a Jewish, Israeli, and Latina author, educator, content creator, and artist who specializes in Jewish history and anti-Semitism. I happened to open Instagram during the break, and she had just half an hour before posted a new post on Holocaust inversion. It was really great. Her posts are easy to read and they're even backed by sources. So it's as close as you can get to academia on social media, I think. Thank you all so much for spending the past 3 hours with me. My heart is so full knowing that there are so many of you out there that care about Jews in our field and doing the work. And so on behalf of all Jewish people that you will interact with in the future, I thank you for caring. You've made such a difference just by attending. We have some time now for Q&A. If you have any other questions or concerns, or if you'd like to bring one of my trainings to your organization, my contact information is up there on the slide. I am now ready to check in, see if we have any questions in the chat or if people want to unmute in the time we have left together. Sasha, were there any questions in the chat so far?
No, nothing. Lots of thank yous and gratitude for you, Liya, and for this presentation. But I did not see any questions come up.
Yeah, but thank you very much, Liya. This was fantastic. I think this is one of the best workshops we've ever had, and you're a great presenter.
Wow, that is really high praise. I really appreciate that. Thank you. That's very kind.
I feel similarly.
Yes, Barbara is saying, let your colleagues know this will be available for purchase on the BAPA website. That is good to know because I do often get people who have missed one of my trainings and they want to know how they can attend. I can refer them here.
Yeah, and I was just going to request that people click on the link in the chat for the evaluation so Dr. Levanda can get, and we can get some feedback. I know most of it is very positive, but it helps us to have you fill that out.
Absolutely. This training has been curated in response to feedback. So any kind of constructive feedback you might have really, really helps. Thank you. Last call for questions or comments.
Let's see, am I unmuted? Yeah, would be good to, I lost track of the time. I know originally we were going to go to 12:15 because we were going to have 15 minutes of breaks, but I think we only had 10 minutes. So just to make sure we're complying with CPA's requirements, let's just keep it open for a few minutes for additional questions or comments. I'll just say that my own experience of anti-Semitism, I was one of those people who thought, oh, that was in Europe, it could never happen here. And even in terms of my synagogue being evacuated on several occasions in the last year or two because of bomb threats, and then seeing the armed security guards in front of the synagogue when you go to services has made it much more visible to me.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, in my other training on considerations and guidelines for working with Jewish clients, we talk about how that can be a double-edged sword, right? If you think about Jews of color and how they experience security and police, you know, they're going to experience armed security at a synagogue very differently than other Jews, right? There are some Jews who might feel really relieved to see that security, and there are some Jews who might feel similarly unsafe coming to their place of worship because of that. Yeah.
You know, I also want to say that I do.
Lynette, I don't mean to interrupt, but I do see that Louise had her hand up and I was about to call. That's totally fine. I do want to hear what you have to say, but I want to make sure we go in order. Is that okay?
Sure, please do.
Thanks, Nanette.
Hi, I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you very much. This is a wonderful, wonderful presentation. Can you hear me?
I can, yeah.
Okay, great. But I do have a question, not for today maybe, but to think about, and that is, how as a Jewish therapist, how do we protect ourselves from all of the things that you discussed about with our clients? And secondly, do you have much information about how either Jewish or non-Jewish clients receive our comments when they know we are Jewish? First, I guess what I was thinking of in terms of the people here today, it would seem to me that if I'm a Jew, but as a non-Jew, it would seem to me to be more powerful for a non-Jew to respond to someone's anti-Semitism than for me to respond and have people say, which they've said to me before, well, sure, because you're Jewish and that's just your thing. Rather than
Louise,
pointing it out for what it is, which is bad, whether it's against Jews or against any marginalized population.
gosh, Louise, it's questions like these that I really feel a lot of disappointment and sadness in our field for not having more research on anti-Semitism, because that's a really important question that I think needs to be answered, that we are not able to answer because we don't have the research on it, right? I think you'll have different people who say different things. You'll have people who say, oh, it can actually be more meaningful to have it come from a Jewish person, right? That's directly impacting them. Then you also have people who will say, well, some people will react to that certain type of way, which is in and of itself anti-Semitic. That's, a whole different thing. So yeah, that's my first reaction. And then in response to your other question about Jewish therapists, this is certainly one of the questions that has come up quite often, because Jewish therapists have really mobilized to support our community, and yet who is taking care of the Jewish therapists, right? And so I know, Sasha, this is something that you talk about with your movements as well, is like, how do we as Jewish therapists take care of ourselves? I do know that there are organizations out there that are creating support groups for Jewish therapists. I believe the Jewish Therapist Collective is one of them, and I believe Kesher Shalom Project is another one. Those are two organizations that I know about that I've seen who have some kind of support group or some kind of training around what to do as a Jewish therapist.
And a shameless plug, this is not related to Liya, so I hope it's okay to say, but support groups that we lead like about 25 support groups a week right now, and we have sub support groups just for clinicians.
Oh, amazing. I didn't know that.
I'm going to put it in the chat, and again, not related, and they're completely free and completely for anyone, and we're trying to get an ally support group as well. So you can share these support groups with your patients, you can share them with clinicians. We're trying to design them for everyone.
Well, thank you so much.
Did not know that, Sasha. That's super amazing. Thank you for sharing.
Of course.
Louise, I hope that answered your question. I know it might not be the answer that you want, but I think we all will have many questions that will unfortunately go unanswered.
Yes, no, it was wonderful, and thank you again. I just think that we have to get more information out, not only for our clients but for ourselves.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing, Louise. Okay, Nanette, what was your comment?
Yeah, so Louise, I think, by the way, your hand up was a clap, but I really appreciate what you just said, Louise, specifically the content, this subject, I'm so happy that this was being presented. Just even the title, for people to even think about it, and then, the information. I also want to say, informationally, this is a topic I'm seeped in for a variety of reasons, and still it's really upsetting, to sit here for the past few hours and going through this. And while I really appreciate, that this is what is being presented, it's such a like gut-wrenching, upsetting topic that I know I feel once again shaken from it. And again, it is not new in my life by any means. It's a regular occurrence. So I imagine I'm not the only person feeling that way right now. And just wanted to give voice to it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for saying that. And it is, like I said, it's definitely not easy stuff, but I think it's such important stuff. And that's why I feel so grateful that you all chose to spend 3 hours of your Sunday with me. I do see that we're at 12:15. Does that mean that we are wrapping up?
I believe so. So I think we will probably call it an end at this point. And again, if anyone has questions, you have Liya's email right there. Again, please fill out the Google form. You don't need a Google account to fill it out. It should be available on any browser. And you'll get the CE certificate from Annette, I think in about a week or so. And again, Liya, thank you so much for this incredible presentation, for taking your time to, open a lot of our eyes to this topic. So
It's been a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you so much for being here, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your Sundays.
Thank
as
you.
well.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.